I drove to my father's house carrying a simple birthday gift, completely unaware I was walking into an active crime scene. When my father pulled me close, his hands shaking violently, and whispered a terrifying secret about his drink, my blood ran cold. I rushed him to the hospital, but when the test results came back, the doctor locked the door and told me something that shattered my entire reality. My name is Diana. I am 34 years old, and as a medical financial auditor, I spend my days uncovering healthcare fraud and tracking hidden money. But I never expected to find the most sickening deception inside my own family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect someone you love from toxic relatives. The nightmare began last Saturday at my father Richard's 68th birthday party. I walked into his sprawling estate and was immediately hit by a wall of sheer extravagance. An ice sculpture shaped like a swan was melting on the buffet table, a live jazz band was playing in the corner, and waiters were passing around champagne. It was a lavish display of wealth entirely funded by my father's bank account, but hosted by my younger sister Brittany and her husband Jamal. Brittany, who was 31, had always been the golden child. She recently quit her failing lifestyle blog to move back home, claiming she needed to care for our dad, whose health was allegedly declining. Her husband Jamal, a slick private wealth manager who always wore suits that cost more than my car, was busy working the room. He was handing out business cards to my father's wealthy retired friends, leveraging the party for his own networking. I pushed past the crowd and found my father sitting in a corner wingback chair. The sight of him made my chest tighten. This was a man who built a real estate empire from the ground up, but now he looked hollowed out. His skin was pale, and his eyes were unfocused. Brittany had been telling everyone he was showing early signs of dementia, but my gut told me something was terribly wrong. I knelt beside him and handed him a small wrapped box. "Dad, it is me, Diana," I said softly. He blinked slowly, trying to focus on my face. Then, with a sudden burst of frantic energy, his frail fingers gripped my sleeve with surprising strength. He pulled me close, his breath smelling of citrus and something bitter. "Diana," he whispered, his voice trembling with sheer terror. "Please, could you ask your sister to stop putting things in my juice? It makes my head so heavy, I cannot wake up." My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at the tall glass of orange liquid sitting on the side table next to him. Most people would have panicked or started screaming at Brittany right then and there. But my training as an auditor kicked in. If you want to nail a fraudster, you do not tip them off. You secure the evidence. Just then, Jamal sauntered over, a patronizing smile on his face. "Diana's so glad you could make it," he said, resting a heavy hand on my father's shoulder. "Dad is having a bit of a confused day, but we are doing our best to keep him comfortable." I stood up, holding a glass of red wine I had grabbed from a passing tray. I looked Jamal right in the eye, gave him a tight smile, and intentionally stumbled forward. The entire glass of crimson wine splashed directly onto his pristine cream-colored suit jacket. Jamal shouted, jumping back and cursing loudly. The jazz band faltered. Brittany rushed over, shrieking about the expensive Italian silk and glaring at me like I was garbage. "Oh my goodness, I am so clumsy," I gasped, playing the embarrassed sister perfectly. "Go get club soda quickly." While everyone was distracted by Jamal swearing and Brittany frantically dabbing at his jacket, I reached down. I uncapped my stainless steel water bottle, poured out the water onto a potted plant, and swiftly dumped the entire contents of my father's juice glass into my bottle. I sealed it tight and dropped it into my purse. Then I turned back to my father and faked absolute panic. "Dad, your face is swelling up. You are having an allergic reaction." I grabbed his arm and pulled him up. Brittany spun around. "What are you talking about?" "He is fine. He is having a reaction to the seafood appetizers," I lied smoothly, ushering him toward the front door. "I am taking him to the emergency room right now. Jamal, stay here, clean your suit, and manage the guests. I will call you from the hospital." Before they could stop me, I had my father in my car and was speeding down the driveway. I did not take him to the local clinic. I drove straight to the hospital where his longtime physician, Dr. Harrison, was working a weekend shift. As soon as we arrived, I bypassed the waiting room drama and cornered Dr. Harrison. I handed him my steel bottle. "Test this," I demanded. "Run a full toxicology screen. Do not put it in the official system yet. Just test it." An hour passed like a lifetime. I sat by my father's bed while he drifted in and out of a heavy, unnatural sleep. Finally, the door handle clicked. Dr. Harrison stepped into the room. His face was entirely drained of color. He did not look at his clipboard. Instead, he turned around, pushed the heavy deadbolt on the hospital door, locking us inside. He looked at me with cold, hard eyes and said, "Diana, this is not an accident. He is being poisoned." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the words. Poisoned? Who would poison my father? Dr. Harrison pulled a printed readout from his coat pocket and slammed it onto the small counter. "The lab ran a rapid panel on the liquid you brought in," he said, keeping his voice to a harsh whisper. "It is laced with an extremely high dose of haloperidol. That is a heavy antipsychotic medication. When given to an elderly patient who does not need it, it mimics the exact symptoms of severe dementia. The confusion, the lethargy, the heavy head he complained about. It is all chemically induced." I felt the blood drain from my face. Brittany had been telling everyone for months that Dad was losing his mind. She was not just observing his decline, she was causing it. Dr. Harrison pointed to another line on the report. "There is something else in here. A synthetic biological blood thinner. It is incredibly sophisticated and almost impossible to detect unless you are specifically looking for it. If your father took a minor fall or even bumped his head against a table, this drug would prevent his blood from clotting. He would suffer a massive internal hemorrhage before an ambulance could even reach his driveway. They are not just keeping him sedated. They are setting him up for a fatal accident." My stomach churned violently. "We need to call the police right now," I said, my fingers shaking as I unlocked my phone screen. Before I could dial the first digit, a loud banging echoed through the small hospital room. The heavy wooden door shook violently on its hinges. "Open this door immediately!" a deep voice bellowed from the hallway. Dr. Harrison and I exchanged a panicked look. He stepped forward and turned the deadbolt. The door burst open, crashing hard against the wall. Jamal stormed into the room, his face twisted in a mask of absolute fury. Right behind him was Brittany, her eyes wide and red, already playing the role of the hysterical daughter. Flanking them both were two uniformed police officers. "There she is," Brittany shrieked, pointing a trembling finger right at my chest. "Officers, she kidnapped him. She dragged my sick father out of his own home. Diana, you ran away to be a corporate auditor 5 years ago. You abandoned this family for your precious spreadsheets. You do not get to waltz back in here and kidnap him just because you feel guilty." I stepped in front of my father's bed, shielding him. "Officer, you need to listen to me," I pleaded. "My sister and her husband have been poisoning him. The doctor just ran a toxicology screen on his drink." Jamal let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Poisoning him? Listen to yourself, Diana. You are completely unhinged." He turned smoothly to the older police officer and reached into the breast pocket of his designer jacket. "Officer, my father-in-law is suffering from rapid onset dementia. My sister-in-law has a history of erratic behavior and is clearly trying to take advantage of his vulnerable state." Jamal unfolded a thick, notarized document and pressed it directly into the officer's hands. "I am his legally appointed guardian. This is a fully executed medical power of attorney signed by Richard himself 6 months ago. We have full legal authority over his medical care and his physical custody." The officer scanned the document. "It has the state seal and a notary stamp," the officer muttered, handing it back to Jamal. "Ma'am, this document makes them the primary decision makers." I looked at Dr. Harrison silently, begging him to intervene. "Officers, regardless of that document, I have evidence that this patient has ingested dangerous, unauthorized medications." Jamal stepped right up to Dr. Harrison. "You tested a random liquid from a water bottle that my unstable sister-in-law brought in from the street. You have zero proof it came from my house. If you try to hold my father-in-law here against his legal guardian's will, I will personally sue you for malpractice and report your license to the medical board for colluding in an abduction." Dr. Harrison stiffened. He knew Jamal was right about the chain of custody. Any decent lawyer would get that water bottle thrown out of court. The older officer placed a heavy hand on his duty belt. "Miss, step away from the bed. Right now." "You cannot let them take him," I yelled. "If he goes back to that house, he is going to die." "Step away," the officer repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "If you interfere with the legal guardians again, I will put you in handcuffs for kidnapping and elder endangerment. Do you understand me?" Two orderlies wheeled a transport chair into the room. I was forced to watch in absolute agony as they lifted my semi-conscious father out of the hospital bed. Jamal gripped the handles of the wheelchair with a triumphant smirk. Brittany walked right past me, leaning in close so only I could hear. "Go back to your spreadsheets, Diana. You already lost." The officers escorted them down the hallway. I stood frozen in the empty emergency room, my hands balled into tight fists, realizing that playing by the rules was no longer an option. I did not have time to break down. By the time I walked out of those hospital doors, my phone was already blowing up. The screen flashed with aggressive text messages from my Aunt Patricia, my father's older sister. She was demanding my immediate presence at her house for an emergency family meeting. Patricia had always been Brittany's loudest cheerleader, a woman who thrived on suburban drama and controlling everyone around her. I knew exactly what this was. It was a kangaroo court, and I was the prime suspect. I pulled into Patricia's pristine driveway in an upscale Connecticut neighborhood. When I walked into the grand dining room, it felt like an ambush. Patricia sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her arms crossed tight against her chest. Jamal and Brittany sat to her right, looking like the picture of exhausted, aggrieved caretakers. Brittany even had the audacity to hold a crumpled tissue, dabbing at dry eyes. "Sit down, Diana," Patricia snapped before I could even take my coat off. "I cannot believe the stunt you pulled today, dragging your sick father out of his own home during his birthday party. You are out of control." I remained standing, gripping the back of a chair. "Aunt Patricia, they are drugging him," I said firmly. "The doctor found heavy sedatives and blood thinners in his system." Patricia slammed her hand flat on the table, making the fine china rattle. "Enough with your crazy conspiracy theories. You have always been jealous of your sister. You packed up and left us 5 years ago to chase corporate promotions. You are nothing but a cold calculator who only cares about spreadsheets and audits. Meanwhile, Brittany is the one sacrificing her youth. She is the saint, wiping your father's drool, feeding him, and managing his outbursts while you just waltz in and try to play the hero. You should be ashamed of yourself." I let her finish her little speech. I looked at Brittany, who was smirking behind her tissue, and then at Jamal, who sat back with his arms draped casually over his chair, looking incredibly smug. The anger inside me condensed into absolute freezing focus. "Is that right?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "Brittany is making sacrifices. Jamal is managing his care." Jamal chuckled a low, condescending sound. "We are doing the best we can with a tragic situation, Diana. Maybe if you visited more than twice a year, you would understand the financial and emotional toll this takes." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table, locking eyes with Jamal. "If you are managing his care so beautifully, Jamal, maybe you can explain to Aunt Patricia why you withdrew exactly $50,000 from my father's retirement account this past Tuesday." The room went dead silent. Jamal's smug smile vanished instantly. The color drained from his face, and he uncrossed his arms, sitting bolt upright. "How did you—" he started, but quickly caught himself, his voice pitching up nervously. "I am an auditor, Jamal. You really thought I would not have legal read only access to the family trust accounts from when I helped Dad set them up. I asked you a question. Why did you liquidate $50,000 in cash?" Aunt Patricia looked confused, turning her sharp gaze to Jamal. "Jamal, what is she talking about?" Sweat began to bead on Jamal's forehead. He tugged at his expensive collar. It was for home medical equipment. He stammered, his smooth-talking persona completely shattering. Your father needs a specialized hospital bed, an oxygen concentrator, and round-the-clock nursing care. Those things are expensive, Patricia. I pulled my phone out and placed it on the table. $50,000 for a bed. Funny, because I checked the house cameras before you disabled my access last night. There is no new bed. There is no nurse. Just you, Brittany, and a whole lot of empty liquor bottles. Jamal stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He was cornered, and he knew it. Before he could formulate another lie, the heavy brass knocker on Aunt Patricia's front door banged loudly. Patricia frowned and went to open it. A tall man in a plain gray suit stepped into the foyer. He looked past my aunt and locked eyes with me. "Are you Diana?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, stepping away from the table. The man reached into his jacket, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and pressed it hard into my chest. "You have been served," he stated flatly, turning on his heel and walking out the door. I ripped open the envelope. It was an emergency court order signed by a judge just an hour ago. Jamal had filed a temporary restraining order against me. I stared at the bold black ink at the bottom of the page. It stated I was legally barred from coming within 500 feet of my father, his residence, or his medical providers. If I violated it, I would go straight to jail. I stood in the foyer of my aunt's house, the heavy court document trembling in my hand. A temporary restraining order. Jamal had moved with terrifying speed. He knew exactly how to manipulate the legal system to build a fortress around his crime. I was legally barred from coming within 500 feet of my father, his estate, or even his doctors. If I drove up that driveway, if I even walked into the lobby of Dr. Harrison's clinic, I would be arrested on the spot. Jamal had successfully weaponized the police against me. Aunt Patricia crossed her arms, looking down her nose at me with a satisfied smirk. "I suggest you leave my house, Diana," she said coldly, "before Jamal has to call the officers back to enforce that order." I did not argue. I did not scream or throw a tantrum. I simply folded the paper, slid it into my purse, and walked out the door without another word. They thought they had won. They thought that by putting a physical barrier between me and my father, I was completely powerless. But they fundamentally misunderstood what I do for a living. I am a forensic financial auditor. You can lock me out of a house, but you can never lock me out of the numbers. The numbers always tell the truth. I drove straight back to my apartment, locked the door, and fired up my work computer. I booted up my dual monitors and logged into my encrypted network. Because I had helped my father set up his primary Medicare and supplemental health insurance plans 5 years ago, my credentials were still listed as a legally authorized secondary representative on the master portal. Jamal, in all his arrogance, had only changed the passwords on the banking apps. He completely forgot about the back-end insurance legacy systems. I cracked my knuckles and started digging. I did not go after my father's money first. I went after Jamal. I pulled public records, cross-referenced property deeds, and ran his license through the firm's advanced financial footprint software. It took me less than 3 hours to dismantle the facade of the brilliant, wealthy private wealth manager. Jamal was completely broke. Worse than broke. Behind the custom Italian suits and the leased luxury cars, he was drowning in a sea of toxic debt. I uncovered a web of shell companies he had registered in Delaware, all of them bleeding cash. He had been heavily day trading on margin gambling with other people's money and losing massively. But the most terrifying discovery was the offshore accounts. Jamal owed over $4 million to a shadow private equity firm based in the Cayman Islands. These were not the kind of creditors who sent polite collection letters. These were the kind of people who broke legs or worse. Jamal was desperate. He was backed into a corner, and a desperate man is a deadly man. I pivoted my search back to my father's profile, looking for any recent changes to his portfolio. My eyes scanned lines of code and policy updates until I hit a massive red flag. 3 months ago, right around the time Brittany moved back home and claimed my father was showing signs of dementia, a new policy had been underwritten. It was a life insurance policy, not a small burial fund. A massive premium-level life insurance policy worth $5 million. I clicked on the beneficiary tab. Jamal's name stared back at me. He had used his medical power of attorney to bypass standard family consent protocols. But that was not what made my blood run cold. I scrolled down to the fine print, reading the specific riders attached to the policy. There was a bolded section detailing a double indemnity clause. This meant that if my father died from natural causes, the payout was $5 million. But if he died from a sudden tragic accident, the payout instantly doubled to $10 million. $10 million. Enough to pay off the offshore creditors, clear the margin calls, and leave Jamal and Brittany incredibly wealthy. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitors illuminating the dark room. All the pieces violently snapped together in my mind. The haloperidol was not just to make him look crazy to the neighbors and the police. It was designed to make him dizzy, disoriented, and unsteady on his feet. And the undetectable biological blood thinners that Dr. Harrison found. I suddenly realized exactly what they were for. They were not waiting for his organs to shut down. They were prepping him for a fall. If a healthy person trips down the stairs, they break a bone and recover. If a man full of heavy blood thinners takes a minor tumble, he suffers a massive internal hemorrhage. He bleeds out before the paramedics can even put the sirens on. It would look like a tragic accident caused by his worsening dementia. The insurance company would pay out the $10 million without a second thought. And Jamal and Brittany were going to push him. The realization that my own flesh and blood was plotting a murder hit me like a physical blow. I pushed my chair back from the desk, gasping for air in the dim light of my apartment. A part of me, some naive, lingering piece of my childhood, desperately wanted to believe my younger sister was innocent. I wanted to believe Jamal was the sole mastermind, the manipulative monster pulling the strings, and that Brittany was just his clueless, financially illiterate wife. She had always played the victim so well. But I am an auditor. I do not deal in wishful thinking or family nostalgia. I deal in hard data, cold ledgers, and undeniable transactions. If Jamal was orchestrating a $10 million insurance fraud, Brittany had to be spending the advance. I pulled my chair back to the desk, cracking my knuckles. I opened a new search terminal, routed my connection through an encrypted virtual private network to hide my location, and shifted my focus entirely to my sister's financial footprint. Brittany had spent the last year carefully curating a specific image. Her social media was flooded with tearful posts about the exhausting reality of being a full-time caregiver. She complained constantly to Aunt Patricia about her lack of income and how she had sacrificed her prime years for our ailing father. But when I bypassed her primary public-facing checking account and tapped into her linked secondary credit profiles, that entire narrative shattered into a million pieces. She was not struggling. She was hemorrhaging money at a terrifying rate. I watched a historical feed of cleared transactions scrolling rapidly across my right monitor. I saw recent purchases for $50,000 designer watches, first-class flights to Switzerland, booked for next winter, and frequent massive wire transfers to the exact same offshore shell companies Jamal was using to hide his debt. She was not just complicit, she was an active, greedy participant in the entire scheme. Then a massive pending transaction flashed on the screen, highlighted in bright red by my auditing software. It was an outgoing wire transfer initiated just yesterday afternoon. While she had been busy pretending to cry over my father's deteriorating condition to Aunt Patricia and the neighbors, Brittany had calmly authorized a transfer of $250,000. I ran a trace on the receiving routing number. The digital trail bypassed standard commercial banks and led directly to an elite luxury real estate brokerage based in Colorado. Using a backdoor exploit I had learned during a massive corporate embezzlement case last year, I bypassed the brokerage's public-facing firewall and accessed their secure transaction portal. The official escrow document slowly loaded onto my screen in stark black and white. It was a purchasing agreement for a massive, newly constructed luxury ski lodge located in the most exclusive neighborhood of Aspen. The property featured a heated indoor pool, a private wine cellar, and a listing price of nearly $4 million. Brittany and Jamal were listed as the sole primary buyers. The $250,000 wire transfer was a non-refundable earnest money deposit. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the dense, heavily formatted legal jargon of the contract. I was looking for the timeline. When I found the execution clause, my blood turned to ice. The closing date. The final massive balloon payment of over $3 million was legally due in exactly 3 weeks. The contract contained a brutal penalty clause. It clearly stated that if the buyers failed to produce the remaining funds by that specific calendar date, they would completely forfeit their entire deposit and face aggressive litigation fees. Brittany did not have $3 million. Jamal was millions of dollars in the hole with dangerous underground creditors. The only possible way they could legally secure that Aspen property and satisfy their violent lenders was if a massive influx of cash hit their bank accounts right before the closing deadline. I stared at the glowing date on the screen. They had not just planned a murder. They had scheduled it. They had put a hard, undeniable expiration date on my father's life. He had exactly 21 days left to live before he would suffer a tragic fatal fall down the stairs of his own home. I moved my mouse to download the escrow documents. This was the smoking gun. This was the undeniable proof of motive I needed to hand over to the authorities to override the restraining order and tear Jamal's legal guardianship apart. I clicked the download icon. Suddenly, my mouse cursor froze. The digital progress bar halted at 2%. A harsh, high-pitched error chime echoed from my computer speakers. The escrow document vanished, replaced by a solid black screen. A split second later, lines of aggressive red code began cascading down both of my monitors. My encrypted connection had been forcibly severed from the outside. I slammed my fingers across the keyboard, trying to trigger a manual hard drive backup, but the system was completely unresponsive. A single taunting message materialized in the center of the black screen, typed out letter by letter in bright green font. "Nice try, Diana. You should not leave your digital doors unlocked." The cooling fans inside my computer tower suddenly roared to life, spinning at maximum capacity, as a malicious script began rapidly wiping my downloaded cache. Jamal was actively destroying the evidence I had just gathered. I had to reach down and rip the heavy power cord straight out of the wall just to stop the purge plunging my apartment into total silence. I sat in the dark, my heart pounding in my throat. The countdown had started, and Jamal knew I was coming for him. The next morning, I walked into my firm's downtown office, running on zero sleep and pure adrenaline. My plan was to immediately brief my managing partner on the insurance fraud and request federal liaison support. But before I could even set my bag down, corporate security was standing at my cubicle. They escorted me directly to the Human Resources Department. My managing partner was sitting there at a long table with a thick legal binder. Jamal had beaten me to the punch. While I was sitting in the dark the night before, he had his lawyers draft and file a massive cyber harassment lawsuit against me. Worse, he had sent a formal ethics complaint directly to my firm's board of directors. The complaint alleged that I was having a mental breakdown, violating a court-ordered restraining order, and illegally using the firm's proprietary software to stalk his private financial accounts. Because my firm deals with highly sensitive medical and financial data, they had zero tolerance for rogue auditors. They did not even let me explain. I was immediately stripped of my security clearance, forced to hand over my badge, and placed on indefinite unpaid administrative leave pending a federal investigation. Jamal was systematically destroying my credibility. If I went to the police now, I would not look like a whistleblower. I would look exactly like Jamal painted me, an unhinged, fired, jealous sister-in-law with a dangerous obsession. I stood on the sidewalk outside my office building, holding a cardboard box of my desk belongings. Jamal had successfully cut off my access to the financial networks and stripped me of my professional authority. He wanted me powerless and isolated. I walked to a nearby electronics store, paid cash for a cheap prepaid burner phone, and sat on a park bench to think. I needed physical evidence. Digital footprints could be wiped or legally disputed in a courtroom, but biology could not lie. Just as I was calculating my next move, the burner phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text message from an unregistered number. It read, "I know you are looking for proof. Meet me at the sub-level of the municipal parking garage on 4th Street at midnight. Come alone." I did not need to ask who it was. I recognized the clinical precise phrasing from the emergency room. At exactly midnight, I drove my car down the concrete ramp into the damp, echoing darkness of the underground garage. The air smelled of old motor oil and exhaust. I parked near a flickering, fluorescent light and waited. A few minutes later, a modest gray sedan pulled up next to me. Dr. Harrison stepped out. He looked completely exhausted, constantly checking his shoulders and scanning the empty shadows. He walked over to my window and handed me a small, insulated medical transport cooler. I opened the lid. Inside, resting on dry ice, were 3 sealed vials of dark red blood. "I drew these right before Jamal and your sister stormed the emergency room." Dr. Harrison whispered, his voice tight with anxiety. "I kept them off the official hospital logs. This is the uncorrupted baseline. It contains the exact molecular signature of the synthetic blood thinners and the haloperidol. Jamal had his lawyers threaten the hospital board today. They are burying your father's file under a mountain of liability red tape. If anyone finds out I gave these to you, I will lose my medical license and go to federal prison. You need to get these to an independent forensic lab immediately. This is the only physical proof you have left to save your father." I clutched the cooler to my chest, overwhelmed by his bravery. "Thank you, doctor," I said. "You are risking everything for a man you barely know." He offered a grim, strained smile. "I took an oath to do no harm, Diana. Good luck." He turned around, got back into his sedan, and started the engine. I watched as his headlights swept across the concrete pillars, illuminating his path toward the steep exit ramp. I turned the key in my own ignition, feeling a renewed surge of hope. We finally had the bulletproof evidence we needed to blow Jamal's legal protection wide open. But as Dr. Harrison's car crested the top of the ramp, the deafening roar of a heavy diesel engine shattered the silence. A massive, unmarked black pickup truck accelerated out of the blind alley at terrifying speed. It did not hit the brakes. It slammed directly into the driver's side of Dr. Harrison's sedan with sickening, explosive force. The crunch of twisting metal and shattering glass echoed violently through the garage. The sedan was crushed against the concrete retaining wall, the horn blaring in a continuous, haunting wail. The black truck immediately reversed and sped away into the night. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, the cooler of blood slipping from my grasp. Jamal was no longer just a white-collar criminal hiding behind lawyers. His threats had just turned violently, deadly physical. I scrambled out of my car, my knees scraping against the harsh concrete, and sprinted toward the mangled wreckage of the gray sedan. The driver's side door was crushed inward, trapping Dr. Harrison against the steering wheel. He was unconscious, a dark pool of blood expanding across his forehead. I pulled out my burner phone with trembling hands and dialed emergency services, screaming for an ambulance and the police. When the authorities finally arrived, the nightmare only deepened. Paramedics used the jaws of life to extract the doctor, rushing him to the surgical trauma unit. I immediately approached the lead detective on the scene, clutching the cooler of blood like a lifeline. I explained everything. I told him about the poisoning, the offshore debt, the Aspen property, and the black truck that intentionally rammed the doctor. The detective listened, his expression completely blank, while a patrol officer ran my driver's license through the squad car computer. The patrol officer walked over and whispered something in the detective's ear. The detective's demeanor instantly shifted from concerned to outright hostile. He looked at me with deep suspicion. "Miss," he said coldly, "the system says you were served with an emergency restraining order yesterday regarding your father's estate. It also flags an active cyber harassment complaint filed against you by your brother-in-law, The same man you are currently accusing of attempted murder. I opened the cooler, desperate to make him understand. The proof is right here, I pleaded. These are the baseline blood samples. Test them for haloperidol and synthetic blood thinners. The detective shook his head, refusing to even look inside the cooler. I cannot accept random biological material handed to me in a parking garage by a woman violating a court order. There is zero chain of custody. For all I know, you injected whatever is in those vials yourself to frame your family. You are a fired corporate auditor with a documented vendetta. The doctor was hit by a reckless driver in a dark garage. It is a tragic hit and run. Nothing more. I begged them to check the security cameras, but the detective informed me the garage cameras had been conveniently disabled for maintenance 2 hours ago. Jamal had planned the hit flawlessly. I called the hospital an hour later from a payphone, only to receive the crushing news that Dr. Harrison was suffering from severe brain swelling and had been placed in a medically induced coma. He could not corroborate my story. He could not testify. My only ally was completely neutralized. I walked back to my apartment through the cold city streets, a terrifying realization washing over me. The police were not going to help. The legal system was completely weaponized against me. If I waited for a judge to grant a subpoena, my father would be dead, and Jamal would be closing on a luxury ski lodge in Aspen. I had to step completely outside the limits of the law. I had to catch them in the absolute act, recording undeniable proof that even a corrupt legal system could not ignore. As a forensic auditor, I occasionally worked alongside private investigators to expose massive corporate embezzlements. I knew exactly where they bought their gear. First thing the next morning, I drove out to an industrial park on the edge of the city and walked into an unassuming electronics surplus store. The owner asked no questions when I slapped a thick stack of withdrawn cash on the counter. I purchased 4 high-definition micro cameras, the kind small enough to hide inside a smoke detector or a picture frame. I bought a set of encrypted audio transmitters that ran on a cellular bandwidth, bypassing any local wireless networks Jamal might be monitoring. Finally, I bought a professional-grade lock-picking kit and a heavy tactical flashlight. I spent the entire afternoon sitting on my living room floor, tearing apart my own apartment locks, practicing until my fingers bled and I could pop a deadbolt in under 30 seconds. I mapped out the blueprints of my father's house from memory, planning my exact route past the exterior security gates. I was mentally preparing myself to commit multiple felonies to save my father's life. I laid the micro cameras out on my coffee table, syncing them to a secure server on my new burner laptop. I was completely focused, ready to risk my own freedom to expose my sister and her husband. Just as I clicked the final confirmation prompt on the software, my personal cell phone lit up on the kitchen counter. The screen illuminated the dark room with a single glaring notification. It was a text message from my father's personal phone number. I grabbed the device, my hands shaking violently as I read the words displayed on the screen. "Help me. They are moving my bed near the stairs." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, the blood rushing in my ears. "Help me. They are moving my bed near the stairs." The timeline had just violently accelerated. Jamal was not waiting for the Aspen closing date anymore. The police involvement, the brutal accident with Dr. Harrison, and my snooping had completely spooked him. He was pushing the schedule up to tonight. I grabbed my tactical backpack, shoved the micro cameras and lock-picking kit inside, and threw on the dark blue coveralls I had purchased earlier that afternoon. The heavy canvas had a fake corporate logo stitched onto the chest pocket that read, "Apex Heating and Cooling." I pulled a matching baseball cap low over my face and grabbed a heavy metal clipboard. I was no longer a suspended corporate auditor. I was an emergency HVAC technician on a late-night service call. I sped across town, my heart hammering against my ribs with every red light I was forced to run. My father lived in a highly exclusive gated community that employed 24-hour private security. Driving up to the front gate in my own sedan would have triggered an immediate call to the police for violating the restraining order. but a commercial van with a magnetic Apex heating logo slapped on the side door, driven by a woman in dirty coveralls, looking annoyed about a midnight call-out, was practically invisible. I pulled up to the brightly lit guard shack and rolled my window down, keeping my face shadowed by the brim of my cap. "Emergency compressor failure at Lot 42, I said in a flat, irritated voice, tapping my metal clipboard aggressively against the steering wheel. The owner called it in. They said water is leaking heavily through the ceiling drywall and threatening the electrical wiring. The young guard barely glanced at me. He checked his computer monitor, saw no active notes prohibiting contractors for that address, and hit the large green button to raise the heavy iron gate. Just get it fixed quickly, he muttered, turning his attention back to his cell phone. I drove the van slowly down the winding, manicured streets, pulling into the long driveway of my father's estate. The massive house was completely dark, except for a single security light illuminating the front porch. I knew from checking my sister's public social media accounts that she and Jamal were currently attending a high-profile charity gala downtown. They had posted a picture of themselves smiling in a tuxedo and a sequined evening gown just an hour ago, establishing a rock-solid public alibi. While they were sipping expensive champagne in front of photographers, my father was supposed to suffer a tragic, fatal accident alone in the dark. I slipped out of the van, keeping low to the ground, and moved swiftly toward the back of the house. Jamal had upgraded the digital security pad on the front door, but I knew my father had a traditional deadbolt installed on the heavy oak door leading from the rear patio into the kitchen. I crouched in the shadows, pulled out my lock-picking kit, and slid the tension wrench into the keyhole. My hands were shaking with pure adrenaline, but the muscle memory from my agonizing practice session kicked in. I manipulated the pins with the metal pick, listening closely to the tiny mechanics. 1 click, 2 clicks. A heavy thud echoed as the lock mechanism finally gave way. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. I stepped into the suffocating silence of the dark kitchen, carefully closing the door behind me. I pulled out my tactical flashlight, keeping the beam pointed directly at the floor to avoid alerting any neighbors. I moved quickly through the first floor, peeling the backing off the first adhesive micro camera and attaching it high up in the corner of the living room molding. I angled the tiny lens perfectly toward the bottom of the grand staircase. The air inside the house felt thick and unnaturally still. I crept up the carpeted stairs, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it would echo through the empty halls. When I reached the second-floor landing, I aimed my flashlight toward the master suite. The heavy double doors were wide open, and the terrifying text message was completely real. The heavy oak medical bed, which usually sat securely in the center of the spacious room, had been pushed violently across the hardwood floor. It was now positioned dangerously close to the very edge of the steep descending staircase. The murderous intent was horrifyingly obvious. I took a deep breath and stepped toward the doorway to finally reach my father. Suddenly, the harsh electronic chirp of the digital security pad echoed from the front porch directly below me. Someone had just punched in the correct access code. I froze in my tracks, killing my flashlight instantly. The heavy front door swung open, the hinges groaning loudly in the quiet house. Bright overhead lights snapped on in the foyer, casting long, threatening shadows up the stairs. Heavy, familiar footsteps clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. "Hello," a sharp, arrogant voice called out into the empty house. Jamal asked me to come check the perimeter. "Richard, are you awake up there?" My blood ran completely cold. It was not Jamal or Brittany. It was Aunt Patricia, and she was already walking toward the bottom of the stairs, her hand gripping the banister. I pressed my back flat against the wall of the second-floor landing, holding my breath as Aunt Patricia's heavy footsteps echoed on the wooden stairs. I prayed she would just check the lower level and leave, but the footsteps kept climbing. Suddenly, the glaring overhead chandelier of the stairwell snapped on, flooding the entire landing in blinding yellow light. There was nowhere to hide. Patricia reached the top of the stairs and stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes darted from my heavy work boots up to the fake heating company logo on my coveralls and finally to my face beneath the dark baseball cap. For a split second, she looked genuinely terrified, thinking I was a real burglar. Then her eyes narrowed into sharp, familiar slits of absolute disdain. "Diana," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "What on earth are you doing here dressed like a common laborer? You are violating a federal court order." I stepped forward, pulling the cap off my head. "Aunt Patricia, you have to listen to me," I pleaded, keeping my voice low but frantic. "Look at his room. Look at the bed." Jamal and Brittany pushed it right to the edge of the stairs. They have him heavily medicated on biological blood thinners. They are going to push him down these steps tonight to collect a $10 million life insurance policy. I gestured wildly toward the master suite, expecting my aunt to gasp, to rush to her brother's side, to show even a sliver of human decency. Instead, Patricia did not even turn her head to look at the bed. She reached into her expensive designer handbag, pulled out her cell phone, and stared at me with a cold, calculated smirk. She tapped the screen 3 times and brought the phone to her ear. "Yes, 911 emergency," she said loudly, her tone instantly shifting into a hysterical, trembling pitch. "I need multiple officers immediately at the Richard estate in the gated community. There is an intruder in the house. It is my deranged niece. She has broken in wearing a disguise. She has an active emergency restraining order against her, and she is currently threatening the life of my severely ill brother. Please hurry. I am terrified for my life." She hung up the phone and slipped it back into her purse, dropping the frightened act entirely. "Are you insane?" I shouted, abandoning all stealth and stepping toward her. "I just told you they are going to murder your own brother. He is your blood." Patricia crossed her arms, standing firmly between me and the descending staircase, completely blocking my only exit. "My brother was dead to me the moment he refused to bail my son out of bankruptcy 5 years ago," she sneered, her eyes gleaming with malice. "I always knew you were the bad seed, Diana. You are exactly like him. Arrogant, obsessed with your corporate audits, thinking you are morally superior to the rest of us. You abandoned this family for your career. Brittany actually stayed. And because Brittany stayed, she understands loyalty. She promised me the deed to the Summer Lake house in the new will once your father tragically passes away. It is already drafted and signed. I am not going to let you ruin my secure retirement just because you suddenly grew a conscience." My stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. She knew. She might not have known the exact chemical makeup of the poison or the offshore debt, but she knew my father was being marched to an early grave. She had gleefully accepted a piece of the real estate as a bribe to look the other way. The entire family was completely rotten to the core. I turned away from her and sprinted into the master bedroom. My father was lying on the mattress, his skin ghostly pale under the moonlight filtering through the window. His breathing was dangerously shallow. I grabbed the heavy wooden frame of the hospital bed and pulled with all my strength, my boots slipping on the polished hardwood floor as I tried to drag it away from the perilous drop of the staircase. But the industrial wheels were securely locked, and the base was bolted to a heavy steel medical hoist. My muscles burned, but the bed did not budge an inch. I could not move it alone. "Dad, wake up," I begged, shaking his shoulders. "We have to get out of here." His eyelids fluttered, but his eyes rolled back. The medication was keeping him completely paralyzed in a chemical prison. I reached into my tactical backpack and frantically began peeling the adhesive off my remaining micro cameras. If I could not physically get him out of this house, I was going to ensure every single second of what happened next was captured and transmitted to my secure servers in high definition. I slapped one camera onto the wooden bedpost, hiding it behind a draped blanket. I jammed another into the grating of the overhead air vent, angling the tiny lens perfectly to cover the entire bed and the open doorway. Downstairs, the screeching, high-pitched wail of approaching police sirens cut sharply through the quiet suburban night. Aunt Patricia let out a loud, triumphant laugh from the hallway. The flashing red and blue lights began strobing violently through the large bedroom windows, casting erratic, terrifying shadows across my father's pale face and illuminating the dark walls. I heard the heavy screech of tires on the driveway gravel as multiple squad cars surrounded the property. I was completely trapped on the second floor with a semi-conscious man, cornered by the police, and entirely out of time. The heavy screech of tires on the driveway gravel was not the police pulling up to the front door. I rushed to the window and looked down. A massive black luxury SUV had completely bypassed the patrol cars, stopping at the security gate, and skidded to a violent tearing halt right on the front lawn. Patricia had not just called 911. She had called Jamal the second she heard a noise upstairs. The heavy front doors flew open again. Jamal and Brittany stormed into the foyer, still dressed in their high-end formal wear from the charity gala. Jamal did not even look at Patricia. He immediately turned toward the open door and shouted to the uniformed officers who were just now jogging up the driveway. He yelled that he was the legal homeowner, that his severely ill father was trapped inside with a violent intruder, and that he was going in to secure the family before the police entered. He was playing the heroic protector, using his legal status to buy himself a few crucial minutes alone with me. I heard his heavy dress shoes pounding rapidly up the wooden stairs. I backed out of the master bedroom and stepped onto the landing, my hands raised. Jamal reached the top step, his breathing heavy, his tuxedo jacket flapping open. When he saw me standing there in the fake heating repair uniform, a slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. He reached behind his back, slipping his hand under his tailored jacket, and pulled out a sleek black handgun. He racked the slide with a sharp metallic clack and aimed the barrel directly at my chest. Brittany rushed up the stairs right behind him, her expensive sequined gown rustling loudly. When she saw the gun pointed at me, she did not gasp. She did not tell her husband to lower the weapon. She just crossed her arms and glared at me with absolute hatred. "What are you doing, Jamal?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "The police are right outside." Jamal took a slow step forward, forcing me to back up until my spine hit the wall right next to the perilous drop of the staircase. "The police are outside waiting for my all clear, Diana. And you just gave me the greatest gift I could possibly ask for. You broke into my house in the middle of the night wearing a disguise. You violated a federal restraining order." He stepped closer, the cold metal barrel of the gun now just inches from my chest. His eyes were wide and manic. "Do you know what the castle doctrine is, Diana? It means I have the absolute legal right to use lethal force against an intruder in my own home to protect my family. You are a documented stalker who broke in to harm my sick father-in-law. I can kill you right now, and the law will not just protect me. The law will applaud me." He was entirely right. In the eyes of the law, I was the violent aggressor. If he pulled the trigger, he would be painted as a hero on the local news by tomorrow morning. Brittany stepped up beside him, a cruel smirk twisting her perfect features. "It really is tragic," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "The police will burst in to find that the crazy, estranged sister broke in and tried to kidnap our father. Jamal had to defend us. But in the violent struggle, poor Dad was knocked out of his bed and tumbled down the stairs. 2 tragic deaths in one night. And all the insurance payouts will process without a single question asked." Aunt Patricia called up from the bottom of the stairs, her voice trembling with eager anticipation. "Do it, Jamal. Protect your family. Do not let her ruin everything we have built." They had it all perfectly choreographed. The legal justification, the witnesses, the motive. Jamal planted his feet, gripping the handgun with both hands, his finger resting heavily on the trigger. He looked into my eyes, searching for terror, searching for me to beg for my life. But I did not beg. I did not cry. All the fear that had been paralyzing me completely vanished, replaced by a surge of absolute freezing clarity. The micro cameras were securely attached to the bedpost and the air vent. The encrypted cellular transmitters were glowing with a steady green light, entirely bypassing their home network. I slowly lowered my hands, relaxing my shoulders. I looked at the black barrel of the gun, then looked right into Jamal's arrogant eyes, and I smiled. It was a wide, genuine smile that made his confident expression instantly falter. "Shoot me," I said calmly, my voice echoing clearly in the silent stairwell. "Go ahead and pull the trigger, Jamal. But before you do, You might want to check your live stream first. Jamal's finger froze on the trigger. He frowned, his eyes darting from my face to the dark corners of the landing. What are you talking about? He demanded, though his voice lacked the absolute authority it held just seconds ago. I am an auditor, Jamal, I said, leaning casually against the wall, entirely ignoring the weapon still aimed at my chest. Did you really think I would break into a house with zero leverage? Did you think I would risk my freedom and my life without an insurance policy of my own? Look up at the air vent above my father's bed. Look at the bedpost. Jamal did not move, but Brittany's head whipped around. Her eyes widened as she spotted the tiny, blinking green light hidden in the shadows of the wooden frame. I bought high-definition microcameras this afternoon, I explained, keeping my tone conversational. They are equipped with encrypted cellular transmitters. They do not use your home wireless network. They have been recording and broadcasting every single second since I picked your back door lock. The video is feeding directly into a secure off-site server. You are lying, Aunt Patricia yelled from the bottom of the stairs, her voice cracking with sudden panic. You are trying to trick us. Am I Patricia? I called down to her. Because roughly 10 minutes ago, you stood right there on those stairs and boldly confessed that you knew my father was being murdered. You bragged that Brittany promised you the deed to the Summer Lake house in the forged will in exchange for your silence. Do you know who heard that? Not just me. Jamal lowered the gun a fraction of an inch, the sweat on his forehead catching the harsh light of the chandelier. Who is watching Diana? He asked, his voice suddenly hollow. Everyone who matters, I replied instantly. When you filed that cyber harassment suit and got me suspended, you forgot one crucial detail. My auditing firm has an emergency whistleblower protocol. I forwarded the entire digital file I built on you yesterday to my managing partner and our external federal liaison. The offshore debt, the non-refundable down payment for the Aspen Ski Lodge, the $5 million life insurance policy with the double indemnity clause, and a secure link to this exact live stream. Right now, a team of federal fraud investigators is sitting in a conference room watching you hold a gun to my chest in high definition. Jamal swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He was a man who lived and died by his public image, and I was currently burning it to the ground. Check your phone, I commanded him. Go ahead, look at your email. I programmed a mass send to trigger 5 minutes after I entered the house. I sent the viewing link to your entire client list, your offshore creditors, and the local FBI field office. Jamal slowly lowered the weapon, his hand trembling so violently he could barely hold it. He reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out his smartphone. The screen was already glowing, overflowing with a chaotic flood of frantic text messages and missed calls from his wealthy clients and business partners. He clicked the top link in his inbox. The faint, delayed audio of my own voice echoed from his phone speaker. Check your phone. Go ahead. Look at your email. Jamal stared at the screen, watching a live video feed of himself, standing at the top of the stairs, holding a deadly weapon cornering his unarmed sister-in-law. The pristine, untouchable facade he had spent years building shattered into a million irreversible pieces. He was ruined. The offshore creditors knew exactly what he was doing. The federal government had him dead to rights. No, Brittany screamed, rushing forward and grabbing Jamal's arm. Tell me she is lying. Jamal, do something. Turn it off. Jamal did not answer her. He looked at the gun in his hand as if it had suddenly turned into a venomous snake. The castle doctrine would not protect him now. You cannot claim self-defense when the entire world just watched you orchestrate a cold-blooded execution. His fingers went entirely limp. The heavy metal handgun slipped from his grasp and clattered loudly against the hardwood floor, sliding away toward the edge of the stairs. Aunt Patricia let out a loud, pathetic wail from the foyer, realizing her comfortable retirement and her entire social standing had just evaporated in an instant. Downstairs, the heavy oak front doors did not just open. They were violently breached with a deafening crash that shook the walls. Heavy tactical boots pounded against the expensive imported tile of the foyer. Get down on the ground. Show me your hands. Show me your hands right now. The voices barking the commands were incredibly loud and carried absolute authority. I looked over the banister. These were not the local patrol officers Jamal had been counting on to protect him. The men swarming the bottom of the stairs were wearing heavy, dark tactical vests. Emblazoned across their backs in bold yellow lettering were three letters that meant Jamal's entire reign of terror was officially over. FBI. The three letters completely paralyzed everyone on the second-floor landing. Federal agents poured into the foyer in a coordinated wave of dark tactical gear and drawn weapons. A tall agent leading the breach pointed his rifle directly up the grand staircase. He did not hesitate for a single second. He barked a deafening order for Jamal to get flat on his stomach with his hands visible. Jamal, entirely broken by the live stream revelation and the terrifying reality of a federal raid, collapsed to his knees. He raised his hands high above his head, his expensive tailored tuxedo jacket bunching awkwardly before lowering himself fully onto the polished hardwood floor. Two agents charged up the stairs, their boots thundering violently against the wood. One of them immediately kicked the dropped handgun far away from Jamal's reach, sending it skittering safely down the dark hallway. The other agent forcefully grabbed Jamal's wrists, wrenching them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking into place echoed sharply against the walls. "Jamal, you are under arrest," the lead agent announced, his voice carrying clearly over the chaotic noise. "You are being charged with multiple federal offenses, including interstate wire fraud, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, and the attempted murder of your father-in-law. We have seized your digital assets, and your offshore accounts are currently being frozen by the Department of Justice." The harsh reality of the situation finally shattered the stunned silence. Brittany, who had been standing frozen against the wall in her shimmering sequined gown, suddenly burst into theatrical, hysterical sobs. She threw her hands up in the air, her perfect face contorting into a mask of absolute terror and victimhood. She stumbled backward, pointing an accusatory, trembling finger directly at her husband, pinned to the floor. "I had nothing to do with this," Brittany screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. She looked at the federal agents with wide, tear-filled eyes, completely abandoning the man she had conspired with for months. "He manipulated me. He controlled all our finances. I did not know about the life insurance policy or the offshore debt. He told me he was just giving my father vitamins to help him sleep. I am just a victim. He brainwashed me." Jamal jerked his head up from the floor, his cheek pressed painfully against the hardwood. His eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated fury as he listened to his wife effortlessly throw him to the wolves. The last shred of their toxic loyalty evaporated in an instant. "You lying hypocrite," Jamal roared, struggling wildly against the heavy agents holding him down. "Do not listen to her. She is the one who crushed the pills. She is the one who mixed the haloperidol into his orange juice every single morning. She was the one rushing the timeline because she wanted her luxury vacation home." Brittany gasped in fake horror, clutching her chest dramatically. "You are insane!" she cried out, backing further down the hall. Jamal was practically foaming at the mouth, screaming over her cries. "She bought the Aspen house. Check the wire transfers. She authorized $250,000 in non-refundable earnest money just yesterday. She knew exactly what the blood thinners were for. She helped me push the bed to the edge of the stairs tonight. She wanted him dead just as much as I did. The federal agents did not care about their vicious marital dispute." Another agent stepped forward, firmly grabbing Brittany by the arm. She shrieked, fighting blindly against the iron grip, but the agent smoothly spun her around and clamped a pair of steel handcuffs onto her wrists. "You can explain it all to the federal prosecutor," the agent stated coldly. I stood near the master bedroom doorway, watching my sister and brother-in-law completely turn on each other like trapped animals. Their perfect, wealthy facade was entirely gone, replaced by the ugly reality of their greed. They were being hauled down the stairs, both of them screaming vicious accusations, their public reputations permanently destroyed by the live stream, still broadcasting to their entire social circle. But amidst the chaotic noise of the arrests, I realized someone was conspicuously missing. I leaned over the wooden banister and looked down into the brightly lit foyer. The area was swarming with federal agents securing the perimeter, but Aunt Patricia was nowhere to be seen. She had quietly backed away from the bottom of the stairs when the front doors were violently breached. I tracked the muddy footprints from the agent's boots leading toward the back of the house. Through the long hallway, I caught a glimpse of frantic movement in the darkened kitchen. Aunt Patricia was attempting a desperate, silent retreat. She had her expensive designer handbag clutched tightly to her chest, tiptoeing frantically toward the rear patio door. She reached for the heavy brass handle, clearly hoping to slip out into the dark yard and completely distance herself from the explosive federal raid. Just as her hand closed around the doorknob, the heavy patio door was suddenly yanked open from the outside. A tall, stern-looking female FBI agent stood on the back porch, a heavy tactical flashlight beaming directly into Patricia's terrified, pale face. "Going somewhere?" Patricia the female agent asked, stepping into the kitchen and swiftly securing Patricia's trembling wrists in cold steel. "You are under arrest for conspiracy and accessory to attempted murder. You are going to need a lot more than a lake house to get out of this." I did not waste another second watching my aunt beg for mercy in the dark kitchen. Heavy footsteps echoed on the stairs again, but this time they did not belong to armed federal agents or a murderous brother-in-law. A specialized team of emergency medical technicians carrying heavy red trauma bags rushed past me, completely taking over the second-floor landing. I followed them back into the master bedroom, my heart hammering violently in my throat. They moved with practiced, incredible speed. I quickly explained the exact chemical combination Dr. Harrison had found in the hospital toxicology screen. The lead paramedic nodded immediately, pulling a series of glass vials from his expansive medical kit. He administered a high-dose intravenous injection of vitamin K to aggressively counteract the synthetic biological blood thinners flowing dangerously through my father's veins. Next, they started him on a rapid saline drip laced with specific receptor antagonists. This was designed to flush the heavy antipsychotic haloperidol from his central nervous system before it could cause any permanent neurological damage. I stood quietly in the corner of the room, my hands clasped tightly over my mouth, watching the digital heart monitor slowly stabilize its erratic rhythm. The paramedic looked back at me over his shoulder and offered a deeply reassuring nod. "His pulse is strengthening remarkably fast," he said quietly. "He is going to be incredibly groggy and confused for the next few days as the toxins filter out, but the immediate threat of a fatal internal hemorrhage is entirely gone." "You saved his life tonight, Diana." I let out a shaky breath. I felt like I had been holding for 5 long years. The paralyzing, suffocating fear that had gripped my chest since I first saw that terrifying text message finally began to melt away. I walked over and kissed my father softly on his pale forehead, promising him I would follow right behind the ambulance. I walked out of the bedroom to let the medics prepare him securely for emergency transport. When I walked down the grand staircase and stepped out through the open front doors, the entire manicured front lawn had been transformed into a blinding sea of flashing red and blue lights. The quiet, highly exclusive gated community was entirely awake and buzzing with scandalous energy. Wealthy neighbors who just hours ago had been sipping expensive champagne at the charity gala with my sister were now standing on their immaculate driveways in silk robes and designer pajamas. They were silently watching the absolute destruction of our carefully crafted family facade. Jamal was already securely shoved into the back of a dark federal SUV. His head was bowed in absolute defeat, his smooth, untouchable arrogance completely extinguished by the harsh reality of federal prison time. But Brittany was putting on a theatrical, desperate show for the entire neighborhood. 2 strong female FBI agents were forcefully frog-marching my sister down the long paved driveway. Brittany was fighting them every single step of the way, her expensive sequined evening gown tearing brutally at the hem as her high heels scraped against the rough concrete. The flawless, perfect golden child image she had spent 31 years carefully cultivating was completely shattered in front of everyone whose opinion she valued. Her expensive designer makeup was running down her face in dark, ugly streaks as she sobbed hysterically, practically choking on her own dramatic performative tears. "I am the actual victim here," she wailed loudly, looking wildly around at the crowd of horrified neighbors who were actively recording her public humiliation. "He tricked me entirely. I am a good, loving daughter. Somebody call my defense lawyer right now. Somebody tell these federal agents I am entirely innocent." None of the wealthy neighbors stepped forward to defend her character. They just whispered furiously among themselves, capturing the magnificent, undeniable downfall of the neighborhood's most perfect couple on their smartphones. Brittany suddenly caught my eye as she was shoved toward an awaiting squad car. She stopped struggling for a split second, her face twisting into an expression of pure, unadulterated venom. She opened her mouth to scream another vicious, hateful insult at me, but a federal agent placed a firm hand on her head and pushed her forcefully down into the back seat. The agent slammed the heavy car door shut, cutting off her toxic voice entirely. I stood alone on the wide front porch, the cool night air washing over my face. The active threat was finally neutralized. My father was legally and physically safe. The toxic parasites that had infected our family were finally being excised by the justice system. I thought the violent nightmare was completely over. I thought my job as a forensic auditor was entirely done for the night. Then I heard the heavy, deliberate crunch of tactical boots on the porch stairs right behind me. I turned around to see the lead FBI agent who had breached the house. He had taken off his heavy combat helmet and his face was drawn tight with grim, serious lines. He was holding a thick, dust-covered leather ledger in his gloved hands. "Diana," the agent said, his voice low and incredibly tense. I looked at the heavy leather ledger, a cold knot instantly forming deep in my stomach. "Is my father okay?" I asked quickly, my analytical mind racing with new terrifying possibilities. "Your father is perfectly stable and on his way to the hospital," he replied, not breaking eye contact for a second. But while my tactical team was sweeping the massive house for secondary threats, we found a concealed biometric wall safe hidden behind the drywall in Jamal's home office. We cracked it open. He held the thick ledger out toward me. "I thought this was just an isolated family insurance fraud case," he continued, his tone turning dangerously serious. "But we found something else in Jamal's safe, something much bigger. You need to see this." I followed the lead agent down the porch steps and over to the hood of his tactical command vehicle. He placed the heavy leather ledger flat against the metal and clicked on a small portable reading light. The pages were filled with dense handwritten columns of names, social security numbers, and massive financial figures. To a normal person, it would look like a chaotic mess of accounting shorthand. But to me, a trained forensic auditor, it read like a perfectly mapped confession. "Look at the dates," the agent instructed, pointing a gloved finger at the top left corner of the page. I leaned in close. Jamal had been running a textbook Ponzi scheme for the last 4 years. He was using the fresh capital from new wealthy private clients to pay off the massive bleeding returns he promised his older investors. But when the well dried up and his offshore creditors started threatening him, he pivoted from standard white-collar fraud to something purely evil. "He isolated the most vulnerable people in his portfolio," I whispered, tracing my finger down a list of elderly clients. "Exactly," the agent nodded grimly. "He targeted widows, widowers, and retirees with no immediate family nearby. He used his charm and his polished professional credentials to convince them to sign over their medical power of attorney and establish him as their sole financial proxy. He convinced them he was protecting their assets from taxes. Instead, he was quietly bleeding their accounts dry to keep his Ponzi scheme afloat." The agent turned the page, revealing a separate, smaller column of names. 3 specific names were highlighted in thick red ink. Next to each name was an insurance policy number and a payout amount: 4 million, 6 million, 5.5 million. I checked our federal database while my team was sweeping the house. The agent continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Those 3 individuals died within the last 2 years. Their deaths were all officially ruled as tragic accidents or sudden medical events. One took a fatal fall down a steep flight of stairs. Another suffered a sudden massive internal hemorrhage. The third supposedly died in their sleep from an accidental overdose of prescription sedatives. In every single case, Jamal was the primary beneficiary of a massive life insurance policy containing a double indemnity clause. My blood ran completely cold. I stepped back from the vehicle, my mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the horror. Jamal was not just a desperate man who made a terrible, greedy decision to save his own skin. He was a systematic, cold-blooded serial killer, operating under the flawless disguise of a wealth manager. He had refined his method perfectly over the last 2 years. My father was not his first victim. He was simply the next mark on a long, calculated list. If I had not trusted my gut when my father whispered to me at the party, if I had not pushed back against the temporary court orders, my father would have been the fourth name highlighted in red ink by tomorrow morning. I realized then that I had not just saved my own family. The micro cameras I installed, the encrypted live stream, I broadcasted the financial digging I did from my apartment. I had completely dismantled a multi-million-dollar serial murder ring. I looked over at the federal transport vehicle where Jamal was currently being held. The monster was finally caged. I thought the battle was completely won and that I could finally drive to the hospital to sit peacefully by my father's side. But the corrupt machinery that protected wealthy men like Jamal was already grinding into motion. The screech of expensive tires cut through the chaotic noise of the crime scene. A sleek midnight black town car violently breached the police barricade at the bottom of the driveway and sped right up to the front lawn. The doors flew open before the car even came to a complete stop. 3 men in impeccably tailored suits stepped out carrying heavy leather briefcases. They moved with aggressive, practiced authority, shoving past the local patrol officers and walking straight toward the federal command vehicle. The lead attorney, a man with silver hair and a notoriously ruthless reputation in the city, locked eyes with the FBI agent. "I am the senior defense counsel for Jamal." The silver-haired lawyer barked loudly, making sure the lingering neighbors could hear him. My client was illegally entrapped by a fired, disgruntled former auditor with a documented history of mental instability. She placed illegal surveillance equipment inside a private residence without a warrant. "Every piece of evidence you collected tonight is fruit of the poisonous tree." The lawyer then turned his cold, dead eyes directly toward me. "And as for you, Diana, we are filing an emergency motion for immediate bail. The second my client is walking free tomorrow morning, we are filing a massive defamation countersuit against you and your firm. You think you won tonight, but we are going to completely destroy your life." I stared at the silver-haired lawyer, his vicious threats echoing in the chaotic night air. I wanted to laugh right in his face. Jamal was caught on an encrypted live stream holding a deadly weapon, and the federal agents had just uncovered a hidden ledger linking him to 3 unsolved murders. There was absolutely no way a judge would ever grant him bail. Or so I naively thought. By 9 o'clock the very next morning, my entire understanding of the justice system was violently shattered. I was sitting in the sterile waiting room of the hospital, holding my father's sleeping hand, when the lead FBI agent called my burner phone. His voice was laced with pure disgust. "Jamal was out on the streets. How is that even legally possible?" I demanded, standing up and pacing the small hospital room. "He is a massive flight risk. He is a suspected serial killer." The agent let out a heavy sigh over the phone line. His defense attorney called in a massive political favor. They woke up a federal magistrate judge at 3 in the morning, a judge who just happens to be a former golf partner of Jamal's lead counsel. They argued that your video was illegally obtained and that the ledger was entirely circumstantial until fully authenticated by a grand jury. The judge set his bail at $10 million. Jamal posted the mandatory 10% in cash through a corporate shell company bond just an hour ago. He surrendered his passport, but he is currently walking the streets as a completely free man. I hung up the phone, a cold sweat breaking out across my neck. Jamal was not going to sit at home and politely wait for a federal trial. He knew the FBI was still untangling his massive financial web. He had a brief, closing window of time to act. A desperate man with offshore accounts and dangerous creditors does not need a legal passport to vanish. He just needs liquid cash to buy his way across a dark border. I knew exactly what his next move would be. He was going to drain his hidden Cayman Island accounts and run. I left the hospital and drove straight to the downtown federal courthouse where the prosecution team was frantically scrambling to build their formal indictment. I barged past the security receptionist and walked directly into the federal prosecutor's temporary war room. The walls were covered with whiteboards, but their financial flowcharts were completely wrong. They were treating him like a standard domestic embezzler tracking local wire transfers. They were moving far too slowly to catch him. "Give me a terminal," I demanded, dropping my heavy bag onto the long conference table. The lead prosecutor looked up highly annoyed. "Diana, you cannot be in here. You are a civilian witness. I am the forensic auditor who handed you his entire operation on a silver platter." I fired back, pulling up a chair and logging into a secure federal terminal without asking for permission. He is liquidating his assets right now. If he moves that offshore money into untraceable cryptocurrency wallets, he will disappear before the sun goes down. Let me trace the dark money. For the next 4 hours, I did not blink. I used the raw data from the FBI raid and cross-referenced it with the metadata I had scraped from Jamal's home network before he locked me out. I bypassed the standard banking firewalls and dove straight into the international shadow ledgers. It was a brutal game of digital cat and mouse. I watched in real time as Jamal initiated a massive sequence of rapid wire transfers, desperately trying to bounce $3 million through a complex maze of shell companies located in Panama and Cyprus. But he was panicked, and panicked men make sloppy mistakes. He reused a specific routing sequence I had identified the night before. "I got him," I shouted, slamming my hand on the desk. I printed the heavy stack of routing protocols and shoved them directly into the prosecutor's hands. "File an emergency federal injunction right now. Freeze these exact 12 accounts under the International Anti-Money Laundering Statute. Do it before the server clocks hit 4 p.m. The prosecutor sprinted out of the room. 20 agonizing minutes later, he returned breathing heavily, a triumphant smile on his face. The judge signed it. "The accounts are completely frozen. Jamal cannot move a single cent. We just cut off his only escape route." I finally let out a long breath, feeling a massive wave of exhaustion crash over me. I packed up my bag and walked out of the courthouse. The sun was already setting, casting long, dark shadows across the concrete parking garage. My footsteps echoed loudly in the empty structure as I dug my keys out of my purse. I reached my car and unlocked the door, but before I could pull the handle, a heavy hand slammed aggressively against the glass right next to my head. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Jamal stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. He was no longer wearing a pristine designer suit. He looked completely deranged. His clothes disheveled, his eyes bloodshot and filled with absolute murderous desperation. He blocked my only path to safety, stepping so close I could feel his erratic, heavy breathing against my face. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. "Unlock them!" Jamal snarled, his voice a guttural rasp that echoed off the concrete walls of the parking garage. "Unlock the offshore accounts right now. I know you were the one who tracked the transfers. I know you gave the prosecutor the routing sequence. You are going to pull out your phone log into your little auditing back door and reverse the federal injunction before I break your neck." He took another step forward, his expensive leather shoes scraping against the pavement. He looked nothing like the polished, arrogant wealth manager who had hosted a lavish birthday party just 24 hours ago. His tailored shirt was untucked, his tie was completely gone, and a thick vein pulsed dangerously against his temple. He was a cornered predator, realizing the trap had completely snapped shut around him. I stood my ground, gripping my car keys tightly. "I do not have a magic button, Jamal," I said, keeping my voice surprisingly steady. "It is a federal injunction signed by a magistrate judge. The Department of Justice has your money. You are completely broke and you are going to spend the rest of your life in a maximum security cell." That was the wrong thing to say to a desperate man. With a terrifying roar of pure rage, Jamal lunged forward. He swung his heavy fist toward my head, aiming to knock me completely unconscious so he could steal my laptop bag and my phone. But Jamal made a critical miscalculation. He still thought of me as the quiet, obedient sister-in-law who sat at a desk staring at spreadsheets all day. He completely forgot that I had just spent the last 24 hours dismantling a serial murder ring. I knew exactly what kind of monster he was, and I did not walk out of that courthouse unarmed. As his heavy arms swung through the cold air, I quickly ducked to the side. My hand dove deep into my coat pocket. My fingers curled around the cold, textured grip of a pressurized canister of professional-grade pepper spray I had purchased at the electronics surplus store alongside the micro cameras. Before Jamal could recover his balance and strike again, I raised my arm, aimed the nozzle directly at his face, and pressed the trigger down hard. A thick, concentrated stream of burning chemical spray caught him straight in the eyes and mouth. Jamal let out an agonizing, ear-piercing shriek that bounced violently off the low ceiling of the parking garage. He stumbled backward, dropping his hands from me to desperately claw at his burning face. The cayenne pepper resin was blinding him, searing his lungs as he gasped for air. But a man facing life in federal prison does not give up easily. Blinded and choking, he blindly charged forward again, swinging his arms wildly in a desperate attempt to grab me. His heavy hand caught the strap of my laptop bag, yanking me violently forward onto the harsh concrete. I hit the ground hard, my knees scraping against the pavement, but I did not let go of my purse. As Jamal fell to his knees beside me, reaching out with blindly grasping fingers to pin me down, my other hand found my secondary weapon. I pulled out a compact high-voltage stun gun. I flipped the safety switch off the red indicator light glowing brightly in the dim garage. I thrust the metal prongs directly into the center of Jamal's chest and squeezed the activation button. The loud, sharp crackle of electricity filled the air. 50,000 volts surged directly into his muscular frame. Jamal's entire body went rigid. His eyes rolled back into his head, his jaw locked, and he instantly collapsed sideways onto the concrete, convulsing helplessly as the electrical charge scrambled his nervous system. I scrambled backward, breathing heavily, keeping the stun gun pointed at him just in case he tried to move, but he was completely incapacitated, groaning weakly on the dirty floor. The agonizing screams and the loud crackle of the stun gun had not gone unnoticed. The heavy metal doors of the courthouse entrance suddenly burst open. 4 armed federal marshals and 2 courthouse security guards sprinted out into the parking garage, their weapons drawn and flashlights cutting through the gloom. "Drop the weapon," one of the marshals yelled, aiming his sidearm in my direction. I immediately tossed the stun gun away and raised my hands high in the air. "He attacked me," I yelled back, pointing down at the groaning man. "I am a federal witness. He was out on bail and he ambushed me." The marshals rushed forward. When the lead marshal aimed his flashlight down at the suspect, he immediately recognized the high-profile defendant they had just arraigned earlier that morning. It was the wealthy wealth manager accused of orchestrating a multi-state murder ring. "Well, Jamal," the marshal sneered roughly, grabbing his arms and pulling them behind his back to snap a fresh pair of heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. "Assaulting a federal witness and attempting to flee the jurisdiction. I am pretty sure your $1 million bail was just permanently revoked." Jamal could not even formulate a coherent sentence. He just gagged and coughed up pepper spray as 2 massive marshals dragged him across the concrete and hauled him back inside the courthouse. He was going straight back to a holding cell, and this time no corrupt judge was going to let him out. I stood in the empty parking space, my heart pounding against my ribs, watching the heavy doors slam shut behind them. It was finally over. The mastermind was entirely neutralized. I reached down, picked up my purse, and unlocked my car. I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors, letting out a long, shaky breath. I turned the key in the ignition, ready to finally drive back to the hospital to see my father. Just as I put the car into drive, my cheap burner phone buzzed loudly in the cup holder. I glanced down at the screen. It was an automated message from the county correctional facility. I hit the speaker button. "This is a collect call from an inmate at the county jail," the automated voice stated flatly. Then a hysterical, desperate voice cut through the static. "Diana, please do not hang up. It is Brittany. Please, you have to post my bail." I sat in the quiet driver's seat listening to the desperate, jagged breathing of my younger sister echoing through the car speakers. I could hear the loud, chaotic background noise of the county lockup behind her. She was crying hysterically, playing the exact same victim card she had used to manipulate our parents for her entire life. She begged me to call my bank, claiming she was terrified that she did not belong in a place like that, and that she would explain everything if I just got her out. I did not hang up on her. I did not yell. I simply told her I would see her tomorrow morning during visiting hours, and I ended the call. The next day, I walked into the stark, heavily secured visitor area of the county correctional facility. The air smelled of harsh industrial bleach and stale sweat. I took a seat on a hard metal stool in front of a thick pane of smudged bulletproof glass. A heavy steel door opened on the other side, and a female guard escorted Brittany into the booth. The sight of her was jarring. The flawless golden child of our affluent suburb was completely gone. Her expensive blonde hair was tangled and greasy, her designer gown replaced by a stiff, oversized orange jumpsuit. She looked exhausted, pale, and genuinely terrified. She picked up the heavy black receiver on her side of the glass. I picked up mine. "Diana." "Thank God you came." Brittany sobbed into the phone, tears immediately streaming down her face. "You have to get me out of here. The food is disgusting, and the women in my cell keep threatening me. You have to believe me, I had no idea what Jamal was doing. He controlled all the money. He controlled my mind. He was emotionally abusive, and I was too scared to leave him. He forced me to go along with the medical power of attorney. I am your little sister. We are blood. Please just pay the bail and we can fix this family." She pressed her hand against the thick glass, looking at me with wide, pleading eyes. It was a masterful performance. If I had not spent the last 48 hours uncovering the absolute depths of her greed, I might have actually felt sorry for her. I let her cry for a few more seconds. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out my smartphone. I did not say a single word. I opened a specific audio file I had isolated from the hidden micro cameras I placed in my father's house. I held the phone speaker directly up to the receiver so she could hear it perfectly through the prison phone system. The audio began to play. It was completely crisp and clear. It was a recording of Brittany and Jamal standing in the master bedroom just hours before I broke in, disguised as a heating technician. But it was not a recording of a terrified, abused wife being manipulated by her husband. It was a recording of Brittany laughing. "I cannot believe it takes this many pills to knock the old man out." Brittany's voice cheerfully echoed through the receiver. "I am crushing them as fast as I can, Jamal. Make sure you double the dose of the blood thinners tonight. I am not losing that Aspen House just because his heart is stubbornly healthy. Once he takes a tumble down those stairs, we are popping the expensive champagne." I stopped the recording and put my phone back into my purse. I looked up at my sister. The tears on Brittany's face had completely stopped. Her expression shifted from terrified victim to pure venomous hatred. The mask was entirely gone. She realized in that exact moment that her golden child manipulation was completely useless against me. I had the undeniable truth, and there was absolutely no way to gaslight her way out of a high-definition audio confession. "You were not brainwashed, Brittany," I said calmly into the receiver. "You were impatient. You wanted a luxury ski lodge, and you were willing to kill our father to get it. I am not paying a single cent of your bail. You are going to sit in this concrete box and you are going to rot." I placed the heavy receiver back onto the metal hook. Brittany snapped. She started screaming, slamming her fists violently against the thick bulletproof glass, her face contorted in absolute rage. I did not flinch. I just stood up, turned my back on her, and walked out of the visitor center without looking back a single time. Leaving Brittany to face the consequences of her own horrific actions felt like a massive, suffocating weight had finally been lifted from my chest. Jamal and Brittany were permanently locked away, their bail revoked, and their assets completely frozen by the federal government. But the legal war was not entirely over. 2 weeks later, the initial hearings for the CO conspirators began at the federal courthouse. Aunt Patricia, who had stood on the stairs and gleefully admitted she was waiting for a forged deed to a lake house, was formally arraigned. I sat in the front row of the gallery, expecting her to take a plea deal, given the overwhelming evidence of the live stream. Instead, Patricia's defense attorney stood up in front of the judge and pulled a completely shocking legal maneuver. He announced that his client was pleading not guilty by reason of temporary insanity, claiming the extreme emotional stress of her brother's declining health had caused a severe delusional break. I sat in the gallery as Patricia's lawyer painted a tragic picture of a frail, overwhelmed sister. He spun a ridiculous narrative, claiming that the sheer grief of watching my father deteriorate had shattered her mental state. He argued that the live stream audio was just the rambling of a confused, exhausted woman who could not distinguish fantasy from reality. He asked the judge for leniency, requesting a transfer to an upscale psychiatric facility rather than a harsh federal prison. Patricia sat at the defense table, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, perfectly playing the role of the tragic, fragile victim. It was a brilliant, highly manipulative legal strategy designed to prey on the jury's sympathies. But they forgot exactly who they were up against. The federal prosecutor stood up and called his next expert financial witness to the stand. Me. I walked through the wooden swinging gates and took the oath, bringing a thick, neatly bound folder of certified banking documents with me. The prosecutor asked me to explain my findings regarding Patricia's recent financial activity. I opened the folder, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly at my aunt. Temporary insanity usually implies a sudden, uncontrollable break from reality, I told the quiet courtroom, my voice steady and clear. But the financial records show an incredibly calculated, deeply premeditated series of actions. Aunt Patricia did not just agree to stay quiet for a future stake in a forged will. She demanded a massive cash down payment for her silence. I held up a certified bank statement, and the prosecutor projected the enlarged image onto the courtroom screen for the judge and jury to read. Exactly 1 week before the attempted murder, I continued, Jamal initiated a wire transfer from one of his domestic shell companies. He moved exactly $100,000 in hush money into a newly opened offshore trust fund. The sole beneficiary and signatory of that trust fund is Patricia. She used her own social security number and her own biometric signature to open it. The courtroom erupted into a low murmur of shock. Patricia's face went entirely white. Her crumpled tissue dropped to the floor. I was not finished, and she was not acting like a confused, grieving woman when she received that blood money, I stated firmly, turning to face the jury. The very next day, she transferred $30,000 from that trust to pay off the remaining balance on her luxury SUV. Then she booked a $20,000 first-class cruise to the Bahamas for next spring. Those are the financial actions of a woman who is completely lucid, incredibly greedy, and entirely aware of the horrific crimes she is actively covering up. The defense attorney leaped to his feet, shouting a frantic objection, but the judge slammed his wooden gavel down hard. The evidence was absolute and irrefutable. The entire temporary insanity defense crumbled into dust right in front of their eyes. You cannot claim a sudden break from reality when you have been meticulously hiding 6 figures of hush money in offshore tax havens. When the trial concluded just a few days later, the federal judge did not hold back. He looked down from his bench at Patricia with absolute, unfiltered disgust. He noted her complete lack of remorse, her sickening greed, and her willingness to let her own brother be murdered for a down payment on a luxury vacation. The judge slammed his gavel one final time, the sound echoing like a gunshot. He sentenced Patricia to 5 solid years in a federal penitentiary with absolutely no possibility of early parole. But the financial blow was even more devastating. Because she had knowingly accepted stolen money tied directly to Jamal's larger Ponzi scheme, the federal government authorized full asset forfeiture to pay back Jamal's other elderly victims. Patricia did not just lose her freedom, she lost her house, her luxury car, and her entire life savings. Her heavily padded retirement pension was completely seized and liquidated by the Department of Justice. She was led out of the courtroom in heavy steel handcuffs, crying real bitter tears this time. She had gambled her brother's life for a payout, and she had lost absolutely everything. I walked out of the federal courthouse into the bright afternoon sunlight. The toxic, greedy branches of my family tree had finally been pruned away. Jamal, Brittany, and Patricia were all locked behind bars where they belonged. I unlocked my car, feeling lighter than I had in 5 long years. As I slid into the driver's seat, my cell phone began to ring. The caller ID showed the main desk of the intensive care unit at the hospital. I answered the call, my heart skipping a sudden beat. Diana. It is the attending neurologist, a calm voice said over the line. I wanted to call you immediately. The synthetic blood thinners and the heavy sedatives have completely cleared his system. The chemical fog has fully lifted. I gripped the steering wheel tight. What does that mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It means your father just woke up, the doctor replied. And he is completely lucid. He knows exactly who he is. He knows exactly what happened, and he is asking to see you right now. I dropped my phone into the passenger seat, threw my car into drive, and sped straight to the hospital. I practically sprinted through the sliding glass doors of the main lobby, bypassing the visitor desk entirely, and took the elevator up to the intensive care unit. When I pushed open the heavy wooden door to my father's private room, the change was so dramatic, it literally stopped me in my tracks. Just 2 days ago, he had been a hollowed-out shell of a man, his skin gray and his eyes vacant, trapped in a chemical prison that mimicked the devastating effects of severe dementia. But the man sitting up in the hospital bed right now was the Richard I had known my entire life. The color had returned to his cheeks. The terrible vacant stare was completely gone. His eyes were sharp-focused and immediately locked onto mine the second I stepped into the room. Diana, he said, his voice no longer the terrified, trembling whisper I heard at his birthday party. It was thick with emotion, but it was incredibly strong. I rushed to the side of the bed and wrapped my arms tightly around his shoulders. I buried my face in his hospital gown, tears finally spilling over my cheeks. I had spent the last 48 hours operating on pure adrenaline and cold logic, fighting a multi-state murder ring. But in that moment, I was just a daughter who had her father back. He held me tightly, his own tears soaking into my hair. I remember he whispered, his voice cracking. I remember the heavy feeling in my head. I remember Brittany handing me that bitter orange juice every single morning, telling me it was my daily vitamins. I remember trying to stay awake, trying to fight the fog, realizing with absolute horror that my own child was slowly killing me. You saved my life, Diana. I pulled back and wiped my eyes. You asked me for help, Dad. I am just sorry I did not see it sooner. Richard shook his head slowly, a look of profound regret washing over his face. No, Diana. I am the one who needs to apologize. I need to apologize for so much more than just these last few months. He reached out and took both of my hands in his. For 5 years I let Patricia and Brittany whisper in my ear. I let them convince me that you moved away because you did not care about this family. They told me you were cold, that you only cared about your corporate audits and your career. I was foolish enough to believe them, and I favored the daughter who stayed behind, thinking she was the one who truly loved me. But I was entirely wrong. He squeezed my hands tight, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Brittany stayed because she was greedy. She wanted my money, and she was willing to take my life to get it. You were the one who built an independent life, and yet you were the one who risked your own freedom, your career, and your safety to break into that house and save me. You are my true daughter, Diana. I am so incredibly proud of the woman you have become, and I will spend the rest of my life making up for the years I let them push you away. We sat together for a long time talking through the horrific details of Jamal's Ponzi scheme and the federal raid. For the first time in years, there were no secrets and no toxic family members manipulating the narrative. Just as we were finally finding a sense of peace, a sharp knock echoed from the hospital room door. The lead federal prosecutor stepped into the room carrying a thick leather briefcase. He looked relieved to see my father sitting up and alert, but his expression remained tightly drawn. "Richard, it is a miracle to see you awake," the prosecutor said, pulling up a chair next to the bed. "But I am afraid we have a massive legal hurdle to overcome, and I need your help immediately. Jamal and Brittany are pleading not guilty to the specific charges of premeditated attempted murder. We have the hidden ledger and the live stream footage from the final night, but to guarantee a maximum sentence, we absolutely need you to take the witness stand and testify about the coerced medical power of attorney and the daily poisonings over the last 6 months." "I do not understand," I interrupted. "Of course he will testify. He remembers everything clearly now." The prosecutor let out a heavy sigh. Jamal's defense attorney just filed a preemptive emergency motion to disqualify him as a witness. The defense team is using the very medical records Jamal fabricated against us. Because Jamal spent the last half-year establishing a documented legal medical history of rapid-onset dementia for your father, the defense is arguing that his brain is permanently compromised. They are claiming his memories are legally unreliable and that he cannot distinguish reality from chemical hallucinations. If the judge agrees, your father will be completely silenced in federal court, and Brittany might walk away with a drastically reduced sentence. If the judge agrees, your father will be completely silenced in federal court, and Brittany might walk away with a drastically reduced sentence. I looked at my father, expecting to see the fear return to his eyes. Instead, his jaw set in a hard, determined line. He threw the heavy hospital blankets off his legs and slowly swung his feet over the edge of the bed. "Then we better make sure the judge does not agree," he said, looking the federal prosecutor dead in the eye. "I am not letting that man walk away with a slap on the wrist, and I am certainly not letting my daughter play the naive victim. Get me a suit and get me a court date." 3 weeks later, the competency hearing was convened in a packed federal courtroom. The stakes were incredibly high. If Jamal's defense team successfully discredited my father, the entire prosecution's case regarding the coerced medical power of attorney would collapse. I sat in the front row right behind the prosecutor's table, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. Jamal sat at the defense table wearing a crisp prison-issued jumpsuit. He looked nervous, but his silver-haired attorney looked incredibly confident. The defense strategy was brutally clear. They were going to humiliate my father on the stand, treating him like a fragile, senile old man whose mind had completely deteriorated. My father was called to the witness stand. He walked slowly but steadily across the courtroom, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit I had brought him from his house. He took the oath, sat down, and folded his hands calmly in front of him. The defense attorney approached the podium, flashing a condescending, pitying smile toward the jury box. "Mr. Richard," he began, his voice dripping with fake sympathy, "we are all very glad to see you looking so well today. However, we are here to discuss your mental acuity. Can you tell the court what day of the week it is?" "It is Tuesday," my father replied firmly. The attorney nodded slowly, like a kindergarten teacher praising a student. "Very good. And do you remember signing a medical power of attorney granting my client Jamal control over your healthcare decisions exactly 6 months ago?" I remember Jamal placing a stack of complex financial documents in front of me during a dinner party, my father stated clearly. He told me they were routine tax deferral forms for my commercial real estate properties in downtown Chicago. He intentionally buried the medical proxy deep within those pages. The defense attorney let out a loud, patronizing chuckle. Mr. Richard, my client is a respected wealth manager. Is it not more likely that your declining memory simply caused you to forget the detailed conversations you had regarding your own health? After all, your own primary care physician noted several instances of severe confusion in your medical file leading up to that date. The attorney was laying the trap, relying on the forged medical history Jamal had carefully orchestrated. He turned toward the jury, ready to deliver the final blow. In fact, sir, given your documented cognitive decline, can you even accurately recall the basic financial structure of your own estate without consulting a ledger? The courtroom went completely silent. Jamal leaned forward in his chair, a smug smirk slowly spreading across his face. My father did not flinch. He sat up straighter, adjusting his tie, and locked eyes directly with the arrogant defense attorney. My estate. My father began, his voice suddenly ringing out with the absolute booming authority of a man who had built a multi-million-dollar empire from the ground up, is currently valued at exactly $12.4 million. That includes 3 commercial strip malls in the northern suburbs, which generate a combined monthly net revenue of $42,000 after property management fees. The defense attorney's patronizing smile instantly vanished. He blinked, clearly taken aback. My father did not stop. Furthermore, he continued, his tone turning razor-sharp. My liquid assets are divided across 4 primary accounts. The largest is a mutual fund yielding a steady 6% annual return, which Jamal aggressively tried to liquidate on the 14th of last month. He withdrew exactly $50,000 from my secondary retirement account at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday, claiming it was for medical equipment. But as my daughter Diana uncovered, that money was immediately wired to an offshore creditor in the Cayman Islands to cover his own toxic margin calls. My father leaned forward, pointing a steady, unshakable finger directly at Jamal. My mind is not failing me, counselor. My mind was chemically suppressed by a lethal combination of haloperidol and biological blood thinners secretly administered to me every single morning by your client and my own daughter. They did not medicate me because I was losing my mind. They medicated me because my mind was the only thing standing between them and a $10 million fraudulent insurance payout. The courtroom erupted. The jury members were sitting bolt upright, their eyes wide with absolute shock as they stared at the defense table. The silver-haired attorney opened his mouth to object, to try and interrupt the devastating flow of facts, but he was completely speechless. He looked down at his notes, then looked over at the jury box. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had not just failed to discredit the witness. He had just handed the prosecution the most lucid, credible, and furious victim testimony the federal court had ever seen. He had lost the jury completely. The defense attorney slowly sank back into his heavy leather chair, his face entirely drained of color. He did not ask a single follow-up question. My father stepped down from the witness stand, his head held high, and walked back to his seat in the gallery. The entire courtroom was thick with a heavy, undeniable sense of finality. Jamal's elaborate fortress of legal lies had just been utterly demolished by the very man he thought he had successfully erased. The rest of the trial moved with terrifying, inevitable speed. The prosecution paraded a mountain of financial evidence, offshore banking records, and expert medical testimonies that painted a flawless picture of a ruthless serial killer hiding behind a wealth manager's mahogany desk. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they filed back into the courtroom, the foreperson did not even look in Jamal's direction. I held my breath, gripping my father's hand tightly as the judge read the verdicts aloud. On the charge of interstate wire fraud, guilty. On the charge of racketeering and running a criminal enterprise, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty. And on the final, heaviest charge of the attempted murder of my father, guilty on all counts. Jamal did not shout. He did not fight the federal marshals. He simply stared straight ahead, his eyes completely hollow, finally realizing that his extreme arrogance had bought him a permanent cage. The federal judge did not show an ounce of mercy during sentencing. He called Jamal a parasitic monster who preyed on the most vulnerable members of society to fund his own selfish luxury. The judge brought down the heavy wooden gavel and sentenced Jamal to 45 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. Jamal would take his final breath behind cold steel bars. Seeing her husband completely destroyed in federal court shattered whatever delusional hope my sister was still clinging to. Brittany's separate trial was scheduled to begin the following week, but her defense team knew they were walking into an absolute slaughter. The high-definition audio recording of her laughing while crushing the lethal pills was an automatic death sentence for her case. Terrified of facing the same massive 45-year sentence as Jamal, Brittany officially caved. She accepted a brutal plea deal from the federal prosecutor. In exchange for pleading guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and severe elder abuse, the government offered her 15 years in federal prison. I sat in the courtroom during her plea hearing. When the judge formally accepted the deal and finalized the 15-year sentence, Brittany collapsed completely. She dropped to her knees right there in the center of the courtroom, her orange jumpsuit pooling around her on the floor. She screamed for our father, begging him to forgive her, begging him to tell the judge she was a good girl who just made a single mistake. But my father did not look at her. He sat perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask of cold closure. Two female guards grabbed Brittany by the arms and forcefully dragged her out of the courtroom. Her hysterical, shrill sobs echoed down the long marble hallway until the heavy metal doors slammed shut, cutting her completely out of our lives for the next decade and a half. With the brutal legal war finally over, I expected to just go back to my quiet, mundane life. I had been on unpaid administrative leave from my auditing firm ever since Jamal filed his fake cyber harassment lawsuit against me. I assumed I would have to fight a massive bureaucratic battle just to get my old cubicle back. But the Monday morning after the sentencing, I received a phone call directly from the managing partner of the firm. He did not ask me to come in for a disciplinary hearing. He asked me to come up to the executive boardroom on the top floor of the building. When I walked out of the private elevator, the entire senior partnership team was waiting for me. They had reviewed the federal indictment and the staggering amount of financial forensics I had independently gathered to expose Jamal's multi-state Ponzi scheme. The managing partner formally apologized for suspending me. They realized that my rogue investigation had not just saved my father, it had completely protected the firm from a massive catastrophic liability scandal. The managing partner slid a thick leather folder across the polished mahogany table. It was not a reinstatement letter. It was a completely new employment contract. They were promoting me to the position of senior director of their newly formed fraud investigations division. It came with a massive corner office, a dedicated team of 20 junior auditors, and a base salary that more than tripled my previous income. I had risked absolutely everything to uncover the truth, and the universe was finally paying it back in full. I signed the lucrative contract right there on the spot. But even with a massive career victory, my personal work was not entirely finished. Before I could step into my new executive role, I had to return to the massive estate. The drive back to the gated community felt completely different this time. I was no longer sneaking past the security guards disguised as an exhausted heating technician in the middle of the night. I was driving my father home through the front gates in broad daylight, the warm afternoon sun shining across the dashboard. The hospital had officially discharged him, and Dr. Harrison, who was thankfully making a full recovery from the hit and run, gave him a perfectly clean bill of health. But walking through those heavy oak front doors was incredibly jarring. The massive house was physically safe, but it still felt completely infected by the lingering presence of my sister and her husband. Jamal's expensive leather briefcases were still sitting by the entryway. Brittany's designer coats were still hanging in the closet. The heavy hospital bed was still sitting ominously in the master suite, a dark reminder of the chemical prison they had built. My father stood in the foyer looking around the quiet house, leaning heavily on his wooden cane. "We cannot live in a museum dedicated to those monsters," he said, his voice echoing in the large space. I completely agreed. We did not hire a cleaning service. We needed to do this ourselves. I called a local waste management company and ordered the largest industrial dumpster they had available. When the massive steel bin was dropped onto the driveway the next morning, my father and I went to work. It was a brutal, exhausting, and incredibly therapeutic purge. We marched into Jamal's home office and cleared out everything. We threw away his custom-tailored Italian suits, his imported cigar humidors, and his expensive set of titanium golf clubs. We went into Brittany's room and completely dismantled her fake golden child sanctuary. We tossed her massive vanity mirrors, her ring lights, and boxes of the expensive designer clothes she had bought using stolen money. We ripped the expensive silk sheets off the bed she had slept in while plotting a murder. The most satisfying moment came when a team of medical movers arrived to dismantle the heavy oak hospital bed. We watched as they hauled the heavy steel frame out the front door and loaded it into a truck. My father moved back into his proper bedroom, sleeping on a normal mattress. We opened every single window in the massive estate, letting the fresh air blow through the halls, completely cleansing the house of the toxic, heavy atmosphere that had suffocated it for months. With the physical house finally clean, it was time to secure the financial foundation. The following week, I arranged a massive meeting in the formal dining room. I brought in 2 independent corporate lawyers and a new, highly vetted fiduciary wealth manager from my own firm. We sat around the long mahogany table, the same table where Aunt Patricia had once tried to ambush me with a fake family court. My father took out a heavy silver pen and officially voided the fraudulent medical power of attorney Jamal had manipulated him into signing. We completely restructured his $12 million estate. I did not just take over as his protective proxy. Using my expertise as a forensic auditor, I designed an ironclad multi-tiered trust. I implemented strict dual authorization protocols for any major withdrawals, ensuring that absolutely no one could ever exploit him again. The money was completely locked down safely, generating interest to fund his peaceful retirement. For the first time in years, the new normal felt genuinely safe. My father spent his mornings gardening in the backyard, his mind sharp and his body growing stronger every single day. I balanced my new executive role at the auditing firm with frequent visits to the estate, enjoying Sunday dinners that were finally free from manipulation, fake tears, and hidden agendas. The nightmare was supposedly locked away in a federal penitentiary forever. But monsters like Jamal always leave a messy trail behind them. About a month after the trial concluded, I was visiting my father for our usual Sunday brunch. I walked down the long driveway to check the heavy brass mailbox. Intermixed with the usual utility bills and real estate brochures was a strange, thick envelope. It was made of high-quality, heavy stock paper, but it had no return address. The postage mark indicated it had been mailed from a highly exclusive financial district in Zurich, Switzerland. I walked back into the kitchen, grabbed a silver letter opener, and sliced the thick envelope open. A small, heavy brass key slid out, clattering loudly against the granite countertop. It was attached to a small plastic tag bearing a 5-digit alphanumeric code. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of typed paper. The message was incredibly brief. It read, "Jamal did not tell the FBI everything. The authorities seized the domestic ledger, but he hid the real collateral before the raid. I was his silent associate, and I am not taking the fall for his sloppiness. Find the box before his creditors do." I stared at the heavy brass key, a cold chill running rapidly down my spine. The federal raid had not uncovered the bottom of the rabbit hole. It had only scratched the surface. I stared at the heavy brass key, a cold chill running rapidly down my spine. The federal raid had not uncovered the bottom of the rabbit hole. It had only scratched the surface. The alphanumeric code etched into the small plastic tag was not a standard bank routing number. It was a highly specialized proprietary sequence used exclusively by private high-security vault facilities. Given Jamal's absolute obsession with appearances and extreme wealth, he would not keep his ultimate insurance policy buried in a dusty basement or a standard suburban bank. I immediately took the key back to my apartment, logged into my secure terminal, and ran the 5-digit code through my auditing firm's private database. I found a direct match within minutes. The tag belonged to an ultra-exclusive subterranean private depository located right in the heart of the downtown Chicago financial district. It was a facility designed for billionaires and shadow corporations, a place where anonymity was the entire point of the business model. I did not waste a single second. I grabbed my coat, drove downtown, and parked in a secure underground garage. I walked into the heavily guarded lobby of the facility, feeling the weight of the brass key burning a hole in my pocket. I approached the bulletproof glass counter and presented the key along with the alphanumeric tag. The armed guards did not ask for my name. They did not ask for an ID. A silent manager simply nodded, badged me through a set of heavy steel doors, and escorted me down 2 flights of concrete stairs into a massive climate-controlled vault room lined with thousands of stainless steel boxes. I walked down the quiet aisle, found box number 4800, and slid the brass key into the lock. I turned it, and the heavy metal door clicked open smoothly. I pulled the long metal drawer out, fully expecting to find stacks of cash or incriminating documents. Instead, I found 3 sleek, encrypted hardware wallets and a stack of black leather ledgers. Next to them was a printed master key sheet detailing exact offshore balances. Jamal had not just burned through the money he stole from the 3 deceased victims. He had successfully laundered their massive life insurance payouts, totaling over $15 million, into untraceable cryptocurrency and offshore bearer bonds, hiding them here for a rainy day. His silent partner in Switzerland had mailed me the key out of pure self-preservation, knowing the FBI would eventually trace the dark money back to him if he tried to claim it himself. I could have handed the metal box directly over to the FBI evidence unit right then and there. But I knew exactly how the federal bureaucracy worked. If those assets went into the government civil forfeiture system, the grieving families of those 3 murdered victims would spend the next 20 years fighting a mountain of legal red tape just to see a fraction of what they were owed. The government would absorb the majority of the funds into administrative fees. I was not going to let that happen. I placed the hardware wallets and the ledgers into my briefcase and walked straight to my new corner office at the firm. I assembled my newly appointed team of 20 specialized junior auditors, locked the boardroom doors, and we went to work. We worked around the clock for 3 straight days, ordering takeout and staring at dual monitors until our eyes burned. We legally unraveled the complex crypto wallets, liquidated the offshore bearer bonds, and mapped out the exact monetary value owed to the surviving family members of the elderly clients Jamal had murdered. Once the massive funds were cleanly traced and verified, I bypassed the standard federal forfeiture channels entirely. Working alongside the sympathetic federal judge who had presided over Patricia's trial, we established an emergency victim restitution trust. Within 2 weeks, we successfully and legally wired every single stolen dollar directly back to the grieving families. The reaction was incredibly overwhelming. These families had spent years believing their loved ones died in tragic accidents, completely unaware they had been financially gutted by a monster. One woman, whose mother was Jamal's second victim, called my direct office line sobbing in pure gratitude. She was days away from losing her own home to foreclosure, and the sudden miraculous return of her mother's stolen life savings completely saved her family from ruin. We had not just solved a complex financial crime. We had restored a stolen legacy and delivered true justice. I tried to keep the entire restitution process completely anonymous. I did not want public praise or attention. I just wanted the horrific nightmare to be over so my father and I could live in peace. But in the modern financial world, moving $15 million quietly is practically impossible. Someone at the federal courthouse leaked the precise details of the restitution trust to the press. The next morning, I drove to work and walked into the lobby of my office building, only to be immediately blinded by the flashing lights of dozens of news cameras. A prominent investigative journalist pushed a microphone toward my face, asking how it felt to outsmart a federal task force and return millions to murdered victims. By noon, my face was plastered across every major news network and social media platform in the country. The headlines were all identical, broadcasting a nickname that would change the trajectory of my life forever. They were calling me the forensic guardian angel. The nickname did not just become a viral social media hashtag, it became my absolute professional calling. In the weeks that immediately followed the massive media explosion regarding the $15 million restitution, my corporate email inbox was completely flooded. I received thousands of messages from desperate families all across the country. They told me horrifying, heartbreaking stories about their own parents and grandparents being isolated by greedy siblings, locked into abusive legal guardianships, and financially drained by the exact same loopholes Jamal had exploited. Reading those tragic messages made one thing incredibly clear. I could not go back to auditing faceless corporate mergers and protecting billionaire hedge funds. Exactly 1 year later, I was sitting behind the sleek wooden desk of my very own independent forensic auditing firm. I had walked away from the massive promotion and the corner office at the corporate agency. Instead, I leased a beautiful sunlit office space overlooking the downtown district and hired a dedicated team of aggressive, brilliant young investigators. We specialized entirely in uncovering elder financial abuse, tracing hidden assets, and dismantling predatory legal guardianships. We did not just audit paperwork. We actively teamed up with local law enforcement to orchestrate raids on corrupt nursing homes and fraudulent wealth management firms. We had successfully recovered over $20 million for defrauded families in our first year alone. We became the ultimate nightmare for corrupt caretakers. Every time we froze a stolen bank account or handed a stack of undeniable evidence over to a federal prosecutor, I felt a profound sense of purpose. I had taken the absolute worst trauma of my life and turned it into a powerful protective shield for others. It was a quiet Friday afternoon. I was carefully reviewing a complex ledger involving a forged living trust in Florida, trying to trace a series of hidden wire transfers. On the wall opposite my desk, a large flat-screen television was playing the local news channel on low volume. I usually kept it on strictly for background noise, but a familiar face flashing across the screen immediately caught my eye. I dropped my pen and reached for the remote to turn the audio up. The news station was running a special 1-year anniversary segment on the dismantling of the multi-state insurance fraud ring. The anchor's voice was serious as they provided a legal update on the high-profile criminals who had once been my family. The screen displayed a stark, incredibly unflattering mugshot of Jamal. The anchor announced that the federal appellate court had officially issued a final ruling on his case that very morning. His expensive legal team had desperately tried to argue for a mistrial based on technicalities, but the motion was brutally and entirely denied by the panel of judges. Jamal had exhausted his final legal lifeline. He was officially transferred to a super maximum security penitentiary in the Midwest. The arrogant, untouchable man, who used to wear custom Italian silk suits and drink imported champagne, was now spending 23 hours a day in a concrete box, completely stripped of his wealth, his influence, and his freedom. Then the broadcast shifted focus to his co-conspirator. The news program had secured exclusive B-roll video footage from inside the Federal Women's Correctional Facility, where my sister was currently serving her 15-year sentence. The camera panned across the harsh, echoing walls of the prison's industrial laundry sector. And there, standing under the glaring fluorescent lights, was Brittany. I actually gasped softly at the sight of her. The physical transformation was absolutely staggering. The neighborhood's flawless golden child, who used to spend hours curating her perfect social media aesthetic, was completely unrecognizable. She was wearing a faded, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. She was aggressively scrubbing a massive bin of heavily soiled prison linens, her face slick with sweat and pure exhaustion. Her expensive blonde hair was dull and tied back with a cheap elastic band. The unyielding reality of federal prison labor had entirely erased her arrogant smirk. She looked utterly defeated, trapped in a living nightmare of her own making. The news anchor even mentioned Aunt Patricia, briefly noting that her appeals for an early medical release had also been swiftly denied by the parole board. She was still sitting in her cell, entirely bankrupt and cut off from the outside world. I watched the footage for a few seconds longer, feeling absolutely no pity or regret. I pressed the power button on the remote, turning the screen completely black and plunging my office back into a calm, focused silence. Justice had not just been served, it had been permanently cemented. Just as I opened the Florida case file to resume my work, the heavy glass door to my office swung open. I looked up and a massive smile instantly spread across my face. My father, Richard, walked into the room. He looked absolutely incredible. He was dressed in a sharp, casual suit, walking perfectly upright without a cane. The frail, terrified man from a year ago was entirely gone, replaced by a vibrant, healthy father. He had driven downtown just to take me to lunch, refusing to let me work through my break. In his hand, he carried a tall glass filled with a bright, vibrant liquid. He walked over to my desk and gently set it down right next to my legal pads. It was a glass of fresh, cold orange juice. He looked at me, his eyes crinkling warmly at the corners, and offered a bright, loving smile. He looked at me, his eyes crinkling warmly at the corners, and offered a bright, loving smile. I took the glass from his hand, taking a long, refreshing sip of the orange juice. It was sweet, perfectly cold, and entirely safe. We sat down together in the comfortable leather chairs opposite my desk. He asked me about the complex Florida case I was currently reviewing, listening intently as I explained how another corrupt guardian was trying to hide stolen assets through fake limited liability companies. He did not look at his watch or pretend to be interested just to be polite. He was genuinely fascinated by my work. He told me how incredibly proud he was that I had taken our family nightmare and transformed it into a powerful weapon for justice. Later that evening, after I finished my paperwork, I drove back with him to the estate in the suburbs. We sat out on the large wrap-around wooden porch, settling into the comfortable rocking chairs. The sun was slowly setting over the horizon, casting a beautiful, warm, golden glow across the manicured lawn. The evening air was crisp and peaceful. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had once choked this beautiful property was entirely a thing of the past. There was no more walking on eggshells, no more whispered arguments, and no more fake smiles for the sake of neighborhood appearances. As we sat there watching the first few fireflies begin to light up the dark yard, I took a moment to reflect on the chaotic, terrifying journey of the past 12 months. Growing up in a wealthy, status-obsessed environment, I had always been taught that blood family was the most important thing in the world. I was socially conditioned to believe that sharing the same DNA meant you owed someone your blind, unconditional loyalty, no matter how terribly they treated you. Brittany, Jamal, and Aunt Patricia had aggressively used that exact societal expectation as a weapon. They hid their sickening greed behind the sacred, untouchable label of family, assuming I would simply fall in line, keep my mouth shut, and let them quietly destroy my father for a massive insurance payout. But sitting there on the quiet porch, listening to the gentle evening breeze rustle through the large oak trees, I realized the absolute truth. Blood does not make a family. Biology is just a random lottery. True loyalty, unwavering honesty, and mutual respect are the only things that genuinely make a family. My father and I had completely shed the toxic weight of relatives who only valued us for what they could physically extract from our bank accounts. People often ask me if sending my own sister and my brother-in-law to a high-security federal penitentiary felt like the ultimate revenge. I would be lying if I said there was no deep satisfaction in watching Jamal lose his arrogant smirk in that courtroom, or seeing Brittany face the brutal, exhausting reality of her 15-year sentence in the prison laundry room. They earned every single second of their miserable punishments. But true sweet revenge is not just about watching the people who wronged you suffer. It is about completely reclaiming the power and the peace they tried to permanently steal from you. My ultimate revenge was taking back absolute control of my own narrative. It was rescuing my father from a horrifying chemical prison and ensuring that his hard-earned legacy would never be tainted by their filthy, murderous hands. It was building a highly successful, independent life where my specialized skills as a forensic auditor are utilized every single day to protect the most vulnerable members of our society, rather than just enriching faceless corporate shareholders. My father reached across the small wrought iron table separating our rocking chairs and gently patted my hand. He looked healthier, sharper, and happier than he had in over a decade. He told me that he had recently spoken to his lawyers about adjusting the ironclad trust we had set up. He did not want to just leave his wealth sitting in an account. He was establishing a massive charitable foundation in my honor, dedicated exclusively to funding emergency legal aid for elderly victims of financial abuse. We did not need a massive fake family gathering to fill the large empty rooms of the estate. We just needed each other. The bond we shared now was entirely unbreakable, forged in the intense, terrifying fire of absolute truth and survival. We had faced the absolute worst kind of betrayal imaginable, orchestrated by the people who were supposed to love us the most, and we had come out the other side completely victorious. We had each other. We had our freedom, and we had our unshakable integrity. Have you ever had to expose a toxic family member to protect someone you love? Drop your story in the comments. Like and subscribe for more. The harrowing story of Diana and her father serves as a chilling reminder that the people we are told to trust the most can sometimes harbor the darkest intentions. Society often pressures us to forgive family unconditionally simply because we share the same bloodline. We are taught from a young age that family is a guaranteed safe harbor. However, this narrative entirely shatters that dangerous illusion. The most profound lesson we can take away from this ordeal is that shared DNA does not equal unconditional loyalty, nor does it grant someone a free pass to inflict harm. Brittany Jamal and Aunt Patricia actively weaponized the societal expectation of familial duty. They hid their sickening greed behind the untouchable label of family, assuming their victim would remain silent out of obligation. Diana's courageous journey proves that true family is not an inherited right. It is a sacred title earned through consistent love, respect, and mutual protection. Distancing yourself from toxic relatives or actively exposing their wrongdoings is frequently painted by society as an act of betrayal. But setting firm boundaries is actually the ultimate act of self-preservation. You do not owe your silence or your suffering to people who are actively trying to destroy your peace or manipulate your reality. Breaking free from a toxic family dynamic requires immense strength, but it is the only way to build a life rooted in genuine authenticity. Healing begins the very moment you realize your worth is not tied to the approval of people who secretly resent you. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace, please share your story in the comments below to help others find their strength.